Section 41 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Vol.4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois Doyle, The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Vol.4. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 41, The Adventures of Mazen of Khorasan, Part 2. The five sisters soon returned, and Mazen's adventures being recounted to them, they also adopted him as their brother, and he continued with these ladies, who strove to divert him, all in their power, by repeated rounds of amusements. One day they hunted, another hawked, another fished, and their indoor pleasures were varied and delightful, so that Mazen soon recovered his health, and was happy to the extent of his wishes. A year had elapsed, when Mazen one day, riding out for his amusement to the enameled dome supported on 4 golden columns, perceived under it the accursed magician, and with him a youth whom, like himself, he had inveigled into his snares, and devoted also to destruction. The rage of Mazen was kindled at the sight. He drew his saber, and rushing unperceived behind the sorcerer, who was in the act of flaying a camel for the purposes already described, seized him by his hair, and exclaimed, "Wretch, the judgment of heaven at length hath overtaken thee, and soon shall thy impure soul be plunged into the fire thou hast blasphemously adored." The magician struggled, but in vain. He then implored for mercy and forgiveness, but Mazen, convinced by the experience that he deserved none, struck off his head at one blow. Then, informing the intended victim, who stood near gazing with astonishment, of the wicked arts of the accursed Bahram, and of his own narrow escape from almost certain destruction, he advised the young man to remount his camel and return to the spot where he had disembarked from the vessel, which would safely convey him back to his own country. The youth, having thanked him for his deliverance, took his leave, and Mazen returned to the palace, carrying with him the head of the magician as a trophy of his victory. He was highly applauded for his prowess by the sisters, who rejoiced in the destruction of so cruel an enemy to mankind. Many days had not elapsed after this event, when one morning Mazen and the sisters, sitting together in a gallery of the palace, observed a thick cloud of dust rising from the desert and approaching towards them. As it came nearer, they perceived through it a troop of horsemen, upon which the sisters, desiring Mazen to retire into an inner chamber, went to the gateway to inquire who the strangers might be. They were servants of the genie sultan, father of the ladies, and sent by him to conduct them to his presence, in order to attend the nuptials of a near relation. Upon his summons, the sisters prepared for the journey, and at the end of 3 days departed, assuring Mazen that they would return in a month. At taking leave, they gave him the keys of every apartment in the palace, telling him that he might open every door except one, which to enter might be attended with unpleasant consequences, and therefore had better be avoided. Mazen promised to observe their caution, and for many days was so well amused in examining the magnificent rooms and curiosities of the palace that he did not feel a wish to transgress till the forbidden door alone remained unopened. Having then nothing to divert him, he could not resist the impulse of curiosity, but unlocked the door, which opened on a marble staircase, by which he ascended to the terraced roof of the palace, from whence a most delightful prospect feasted his sight. On one side his eye was arrested by an extensive garden, in the center of which, under shady trees, was a basin of clear water, lined with gems of every color and description. He resolved to visit this enchanting object, and descending the staircase, explored his way through a long arcade, which led him at length into a garden, in which he diverted himself with the scenery it afforded for some time. He then retired to an alcove on the margin of the basin and sat down, but had not rested many moments, when to his astonishment he beheld descending from the sky a company of beautiful damsels, whose robes of light green silk floating in the air seemed their only support. Alarmed at such a preternatural appearance, he retired to the end of the alcove, from whence he watched their motions. They alighted on the brink of the water, and having thrown off their robes, stood to the enraptured view of Mazen in native loveliness. Never had he beheld such enchanting beauty, but one even more exquisitely charming than the rest attracted his gaze, and from the instant fixed the affections of his heart. They now plunged into the basin, where for some time they amused themselves by swimming, every now and then playfully dashing the water over themselves and each other. When satiated with frolic, they came out of the water, sat for some time on the verdant margin, then dressed themselves, and adjusting their robes to the air, soared aloft, and were soon far from the sight of the enamored Mazen, who followed them till his eyes could stretch no farther. Then, despairing of ever again beholding the object of his affections, he fainted on the grass, and it was some time before he recovered his senses. He returned melancholy to the palace, and spent the night in reposeless agitation. The following morning the 7 sisters returned, and she who had first welcomed him to their abode, and had ever since retained for Mazen the purest affection, ran with eagerness to inquire after his health. Great was her affliction on beholding him upon his bed, pale and apparently in a state of rapid decay. After many kind questions, to which he returned no answers, she entreated earnestly, by the vow of brotherly and sisterly adoption which had passed between them, that he would inform her of the cause of his unhappy dejection, assuring him that she would use every exertion to remove it, and gratify his wishes, be they what they might, however difficult to be obtained. Mazen, upon this, in a feeble tone, related his adventure in the garden, and declared that unless the beautiful, he supposed celestial, damsel could be obtained for him, he must die of grief. The sister bade him to be comforted, for in a short time his desires should be satisfied, which revived his spirits, and he accompanied his kind hostess to welcome home her sisters, who received him with their usual hospitality, but were grieved and alarmed at the sad alteration in his appearance, of which they inquired the reason, and were informed that it was the effect of absence from his generous patronesses. The next morning the sisters went upon a hunting excursion for 10 days. Only one, his kindest friend, remained in the palace, under pretense of attending Mazen, whose health, she said, was too delicate to bear the exercise of the chase. When the others were departed, she informed Mazen that the beautiful beings he had seen in the garden were of a race of genii much more powerful than her own, that they inhabited a country surrounded by seas and deserts, not to be approached by human exertion, that the ladies he beheld were sisters to the queen of this genii, whose subjects were entirely female, occasionally visited by male genii, with whom they were in alliance for the sake of population, and to whom all the males were sent away as soon as born. She further told him that these females had the power, from their silken robes, of soaring through the air with a flight 100 times swifter than that of any bird, that they were fond of recreating in verdant spots and bathing in the clearest waters, and that the garden he had seen them in was a favorite place of their resort, so that they would probably soon visit again. Possibly, continued she, they may recreate themselves there today. We will be on the watch, and if they appear, you must fix your eye on your favorite. Mark where she places her robes, and while they are in the water, seize and conceal them. For deprived of these, she cannot fly away, and you may make her your prisoner. Bring her to the palace, and endeavor by tenderness and endearing attention to gain her affection and consent to marriage. But remember, when she is in your power, to keep her robes from her, for should she regain possession of them, she would certainly return to the flying islands, and you would see her no more. Mazen and his adopted sister now repaired to the garden, and seated themselves in the alcove. Nor had they been there long when the fair genii appeared as before, descended on the margin of the basin, and all having undressed, each laying her robes by themselves, rushed playfully into the water, in which they began to swim, dive, and besprinkle playfully each other. Mazen, whose eager eye had ardently watched his beloved, swiftly but cautiously snatching up the robes of his mistress, conveyed them to the alcove unobserved by the fair bathers, who, when they had sufficiently amused themselves, quitted the water, and ascending the bank, began to dress. But how can we describe the distressful confusion of the unhappy genie whose robes had been stolen? Big tears rolled down her beautiful cheeks. She beat her bosom, tore her hair, and uttered loud shrieks, while her sisters, instead of consoling her, were concerned only for their own safety, and dressing themselves with confused haste, bade her farewell, mounted into the air, and disappeared. On their departure, Mazen and his adopted sister approached, and saluting the disconsolate genie, endeavored to console her, but for the present in vain, her mind being intent only on the sad captivity she thought awaited her, and the loss of her native country and relations. They led her gently to the palace, and Mazen, retiring respectfully, left her to the care of his adopted sister, who, by 1,000 endearments and attentions, so gained upon her that in 2 days the genie began to recover her spirits, and consented to receive Mazen as her husband, when the ladies should return from the chase. On their arrival at the palace, they were informed by their sisters of what had happened, and introduced to the fair stranger, who, diverted by their company and attentions, now scarcely regretted her captivity. Preparations were made for the nuptials, and in a short time Mazen was made happy in the possession of his beloved genie. A round of festivities succeeded their marriage, and the 7 sisters strove with each other who should by invention of new amusements make their residence among them most delightful to the happy pair. Mazen, however, now began to think of his mother and his native city with fond regret, and at length begged leave of his kind patronesses to return home, to which request they, from admiration of his filial love, though unwilling to part, consented, and a day was fixed for his departure. The time being arrived, the sisters beat their magical drum, when several camels appeared at the gates of the palace, heavily laden with the richest goods, a large sum of money, valuable jewels, and refreshments for the journey, led by proper attendants. One camel carried a splendid litter for the conveyance of his wife, and another was richly caparisoned for the use of Mazen, who, having taken an affectionate leave of his generous benefactresses, whom he promised to revisit at some future time, departed, and pursued the route back towards the seashore, where he had disembarked with the magician. On the journey nothing remarkable occurred, and on their arrival at the coast they found a vessel ready to receive them, when the wind proving fair, a short time carried them safely to Bussorah, where Mazen had the satisfaction of finding his mother alive, though greatly wasted with constant grief and lamentation for his loss. To describe the joy of their meeting is impossible, for never was there more tender affection between parent and child than subsisted between Mazen and his mother. She seemed to gain new life from his recovery, and again to grow young. The fair genie, who was now in the way of being a mother, appeared perfectly contented in her situation, and Mazen, so unexpectedly restored to his country, was happy in the possession of all he wished. For the generous sisters had bestowed such wealth upon him that in addition to the domestic felicity he enjoyed, he was now one of the richest persons in all of Bussorah. 3 years had rolled away in undisturbed happiness, during which the fair genie had borne him 2 sons, when Mazen thought it grateful to perform his promise to the 7 sisters, the benevolent foundresses of his good fortune. Having accordingly made preparations for his journey, he committed his wife's native robes to the care of his mother, giving her the key of a secret recess in which he had lodged them, but with a strict charge not to let the genie put them on, lest an irresistible impulse might inspire her to fly away to her own country. For though in general she had seemed contented, he had heard her now and then express a wish to be again with her own friends and species. The mother promised obedience, and Mazen, having taken an affectionate leave of her, his wife and children, with assurances of speedy return, embarked on board a vessel and pursued his voyage, which was uncommonly prosperous. On his landing he found camels waiting his arrival on the beach, for the genie ladies, by magic arts, knew of his coming, and had stationed them for his conveyance to their palace, which he reached in safety, and was received with the most affectionate welcomes and hospitality. Some time after the departure of Mazen, his wife requested her mother-in-law's permission to amuse herself at a public bath, and the old lady willingly accompanied her and the children to the most celebrated hammam in the city, which was frequented by the ladies and those of the chief personages of the court, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, then happening to be in Bussorah. When they reached the bath, there were then in it some of the principal female slaves, attendants of Zobeide, who, on the entrance of Mazen's wife, were struck by her uncommon beauty, and instantly collecting round her, rapturously gazed upon her as she was undressing. The slaves of Zobeide did not cease to admire Mazen's wife till she left the hammam, and even followed her till she entered her own house, when dusk had begun to gloom, and they became apprehensive of their mistresses being displeased at their long absence, and so it happened. Upon entering into her presence, Zobeide exclaimed, "Where have ye loitered, and what has been the cause of your unusually long stay at the hammam?" Upon which they looked confusedly at each other and remained silent. The Sultana then said in anger, "Instantly inform me of the cause of your delay," when they related the wonderful beauty of Mazen's wife, and dwelt so much upon her charms that Zobeide was overcome by curiosity to behold them. On the following day she sent for the mother of Mazen, who obeyed the summons with fear and trembling, wondering what could have made the Caliph's consort desirous of seeing a person of her inferior rank. Mazen's mother prostrated herself and kissed the feet of the Sultana, who, graciously raising her, said, "Mazen, our wish is that you introduce to me your son's wife, of whose beauty I have heard such a description that I long to behold her." When the mother of Mazen heard these words, her heart sunk within her. She trembled, but dared not refuse the command of Zobeide. And she said, "To hear is to obey," after which she took leave, with the usual ceremony of prostration before the throne of the Sultana. When the mother of Mazen left the Princess Zobeide, she returned towards her own house. When she had reached it, entered to her son's wife, and said, "Our Sultana, Zobeide, hath invited thee to an entertainment." The wife of Mazen was delighted, instantly rose up, arrayed herself in the richest apparel she was mistress of, and dressed her two children in their choicest garments and ornaments. Then with them the mother of her husband and a black slave she proceeded, till they reached the palace of the Princess Zobeide, which they entered, and found her sitting in impatient expectation. They kissed the ground before her, and prayed for her prosperity. When the Sultana Zobeide beheld the wife of Mazen, her senses were confounded, her heart fluttered. She was astonished at her beauty, elegance, graceful stature, and blooming complexion, and exclaimed, "Gracious heaven, where could such a form as this have been created?" Then she seated her guests, and ordered a collation to be brought in, which was done immediately, when they ate and were satisfied, but Zobeide could not keep her eyes off the wife of Mazen of Bussorah. She kissed her, and questioned her concerning what had befallen herself and her husband. Her astonishment was redoubled on the relation of their adventures. The wife of Mazen then said, "My princess, if you are thus surprised, though you have not seen me in my native robes, how would you be delighted at my appearance in them? If, therefore, you wish to gratify your curiosity by beholding a miracle, you must command the mother of my husband to bring my country dress." Upon this, Zobeide commanded the mother of Mazen to fetch the flying robes, and as she dared not disobey the Sultana of the Caliph, she went home and speedily returned with them. Zobeide took them into her hands, examined them, and was surprised at their fashion and texture. At length she gave them to the wife of Mazen. When the wife of Mazen had received the robes, she unfolded them, and going into the open court of the palace, arrayed herself in them. Then, taking her children in her arms, mounted with them suddenly into the air. When she had ascended to about the height of 60 feet, she called out to the mother of her husband, saying, "Give my adieu, dear mother, to my lord, and tell him, should ardent love for me affect him, he may come to me in the islands of Wak After this speech, she soared toward the clouds, till she was hidden from their eyes and speeded to her own country. When the mother of Mazen beheld her in the air, she beat her cheeks, scattered dust upon her head, and cried aloud to the Princess Zobeide. "This is thy mischief." Zobeide was not able to answer or reprove her boldness from the excess of her sorrow and regret, which made her repent when repentance could not avail. The old lady returned in despair to her own habitation. Thus it happened to the persons above mentioned. But how was it with the affairs of Mazen? He did not cease traveling for some time, till he arrived at the palace of the seven sisters and paid his respects. They were rejoiced at his arrival, and inquired after his wife, when he informed them she was well, and that God had blessed him with 2 children, both sons, which added to their satisfaction. He remained with them for some time, after which he entreated their permission to depart. They took a tender leave of him, when he bade them farewell, and returned towards his own country. Nor did he halt till he arrived in safety at Bussorah. When he entered his house, he found his mother alone, mournfully weeping and lamenting what had happened in his absence. Seeing her in this state, he inquired the cause, upon which she informed him of all that had occurred, from the beginning to the conclusion. When Mazen had heard the unwelcome intelligence, he cried out in an agony of distress for the loss of his wife and children, fell fainting to the ground, and forgot his own existence. His mother, on beholding his condition, beat her cheeks and sprinkled water upon his face till he came to himself, when he wept and said to his mother, "Inform me what my wife may have spoken on her departure." She repeated her farewell words, upon hearing which his distress and ardent longing for his wife and children was redoubled. He remained mournfully at home for the space of 10 days, after which he resolved upon the journey to the islands of Wak al Wak, distant from Bussorah 150 years of travel. Mazen departed from his mother, after he had taken leave and entreated her prayers for his success. But the aged matron was so affected that she ordered her tomb to be prepared, and did nothing but weep and lament night and day for her son, who did not halt till he had reached the palace of the seven sisters. When they saw him, they were surprised, and said to one another, there must be some urgent cause for his returning so speedily. They saluted him and inquired after his affairs, upon which he informed them of the desertion of his wife, what she had said at going away, and of his resolves to travel to the islands of Wak al Wak. The 7 ladies replied, "This expedition is impossible to be accomplished either by thee or any of thy race, for these islands are distant 150 years' journey, so that thou canst not live to reach them." Mazen exclaimed, "My attempting it, however, is incumbent upon me, though I may perish on the road. If God has decreed my reunion with my wife, I shall meet her again. But if not, I shall die and be received into the mercy of the Almighty." The sisters did not cease to importune him to lay aside the journey, but it was impossible for him to obey them or remain at ease, upon which their grief for his situation increased. They knew that the distance was such as he could never overcome by human aid or rejoin his wife, but they respected his ardent love for her and his children. On this account they consulted with one another on how to assist him on the journey. He remained with them a month, but unable to repose or enjoy their entertainments. The sisters had 2 uncles, one named Abd al-Qudus, and the other Abd al-Salib, who lived at 3 months' distance from them, to whom they wrote in recommendation of Mazen as follows: "The bearer is our friend, Mazen of Bussorah. If you can direct him how to reach the islands of Wak al Wak, assist him. But if not, prevent him from proceeding, lest he plunge himself into destruction. At present he will not attend to our advice or reproofs, from excess of love to his wife and children, but through you there may finally occur to him safety and success." When they had sealed this letter, they gave it to Mazen, and bestowed also upon him of water and provisions what would suffice for 3 months' consumption, laden upon camels, and a steed for his conveyance, upon which he took leave of them with many thanks, fully restored to pursue his journey to the islands of Wak al Wak. With much pain and difficulty he pursued his journey, nor had he any pleasure either in eating or drinking during the 3 months of his pilgrimage. At length he reached a verdant pasture, in which was a variety of flowers, flocks of sheep, and cattle feeding. It was indeed a paradise upon earth. In one part of it he perceived a pleasant eminence, on which were buildings. He advanced to them and entered a court. Within it he beheld a venerable-looking personage, his beard flowing to his middle, whom he saluted. When the sage returned his compliments, welcomed him with respectful demeanor, and congratulated him on his arrival. He seated him, and laid before him a collation, of which they both ate till they were satisfied. End of section 41. Entertainments, Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 42, The Adventures of Mazen of Khorasan, Part 3. Mazen lodged with him that night, and in the morning the sage inquired of him his situation, and the reason of his coming to such a sequestered spot. Mazen informed him, and behold, this personage was Ab al-Quddus, who, when he heard his guest mention particulars of his brother's children, redoubled his attentions to him, and said, "Did they give you any letter?" Mazen replied, "Yes." He eagerly exclaimed, "Give it to me." He gave it to him. When he opened it, read it to himself, and considered the contents word by word. Ab al-Quddus gazed earnestly at Mazen, reflected on his adventures, at which he was astonished, and how he had plunged himself into danger and difficulty in such a wild pursuit. He then said to him, "My son, my advice is that thou return by the way which thou hast come, and no longer vex thy soul on account of impossibilities, for this business thou canst not accomplish. I will write to the daughters of my brother, what shall make thee happy with them, and restore thy peace. Return then to them, and perplex not thyself farther, for between this spot and the islands of Wak is the distance of 150 years' journey. On the way also are numerous perils, for in it are the abodes of genii, the haunts of wild beasts and monstrous serpents, and some parts also where food cannot be had or thirst be gratified. Have compassion then, my son, upon thyself, and rush not on destruction." Ab al-Quddus continued to dissuade him from his resolution during 3 days, but he would not hear advice or reproof. On the 3rd he prepared to depart, being sufficiently refreshed, upon which the old man, seeing his steadiness, arose, kindled a fire, cast into it some perfumes, and uttered incantations to Mazen unintelligible, when suddenly appeared a genie, in stature 40 cubits. He was one of the subdued spirits of our Lord Solomon. He muttered and growled, saying, "For what, my lord, hast thou summoned me here? Shall I tear up this eminence by the roots, and hurl it beyond the mountains of Kaf?" Ab al-Quddus replied, "God be merciful to thee. I have occasion for thee, and request that thou wilt accomplish my wish in 1 day." Upon which the genie answered, "To hear is to obey." Ab al-Quddus then said to the genie, "Take up this young man, and convey him to my brother Ab al-Sulib." He consented, though the distance was a common journey of 70 years. The genie advanced, seized Mazen, and placing him upon his shoulders, soared with him through the air from morning till sunset, when he descended before Ab al-Sulib, paid his respects, and informed him of the commands of his brother Ab al-Quddus. Upon this he greeted Mazen, who presented him the letter from the daughters of his brother, which he opened and read. When he had examined the contents, he was astonished at the circumstances which had befallen Mazen, his arrival with him, and his resolve to penetrate the islands of Wak. He then said to him, "My son, I advise that thou vex not thyself with these difficulties and dangers, for thou canst never attain thy object, or reach these islands." Mazen now began to despair, and at the remembrance of his wife and children, to weep bitterly, insomuch that he fainted, which, when Abd al-Salib beheld, his heart sympathized with his unhappy condition. He perceived that he would not return from his pursuit, or be controlled, and therefore thought it best to assist his progress towards the islands. Going into another apartment, he kindled a fire, over which he sprinkled some perfumes and uttered incantations, when lo, 10 genii presented themselves before him, and said, "Inform us, my lord, what thou desirest, and we will bring it thee in an instant." He replied, "May God be gracious unto you," and related to them the story of Mazen, his wife, and children. When the 10 genii had heard the narration, they exclaimed, "This affair is wonderful and miraculous. However, we will take and convey him safely over the mountains and deserts to the extent of our country and dominion, and leave him there, but cannot promise further assistance, as we dare not pass a step beyond our own territories, for the land belongs to others. In it are innumerable horrors, and we dread the inhabitants." Mazen, having heard what they said, exclaimed, "I accept your offer with gratitude." The 10 genii now took up Mazen, soared with him through the air for a night and day, till they came to the limits of their territories, and then set him down in a country called the land of Kafur, took their leaves, and vanished from his sight. He walked onwards, and did not neglect to employ his tongue in prayer, beseeching from God deliverance and the attainment of his wishes. Often would he exclaim, "O God, deliverer from bondage, who canst guide in safety over mountains, who feedest the wild beasts of the forest, who decreest life and death, thou canst grant me, if thou choosest, relief from all my distress, and free me from all my sorrows." In this manner did he travel onwards during 10 days, on the last of which he beheld 3 persons contending with each other, each man trying to kill his fellow. He was astonished at their conduit, but advanced towards them. Upon his approach they desisted from combat, and one and all exclaimed, "We will be judged before this young man, and whoever contradicts his opinion shall be deemed in the wrong." To this they agreed, and coming up to Mazen, demanded from him a just arbitration in their dispute. They then displayed before him a cap, a small copper drum, and a wooden ball, saying, "We are 3 brothers, by the same father and mother, who are both received into the mercy of God, leaving behind them these articles. They are 3, and we are 3, but a dispute hath fallen out among us respecting their allotment, as each of us says, 'I will have the cap.' Our contention made us proceed to blows, but now we are desirous that thou shouldst arbitrate between us, and allot an article to each of us as thou shalt judge best, when we will rest satisfied with thy decision. But should either contradict it, he shall be adjudged an offender." When Mazen heard the above, he was surprised, and said to himself, "These articles are so paltry, and of such trifling value, as not to be worth an arbitration. For surely this shabby cap, the drum, and the wooden ball cannot be worth altogether more than half a dinar. But I will inquire farther about them." He then said, "My brethren, wherein lies the value of these 3 things about which you are contending? For to me they appear of very little worth." They replied, "Dear uncle, each of them has a property worth treasuries of wealth, and to each of them belongs a tale so wonderful that wert thou to write it on a tablet of adamant, it would remain an example for those who will be admonished." Mazen then requested that they would relate to him the stories of the 3 articles, when they said, "The eldest brother shall first deliver the account of one, its properties, what can be gained from them, and we will not conceal anything from thee." "This cap," said the elder brother, "is called the cap of invisibility, by which whoever possesseth it may become sovereign of the world. When he puts it on, he may enter where he pleases, for none can perceive him, either genii or men, so that he may convey away whatever he chooses, unseen in security. He may enter the cabinets of kings and statesmen, and hear all they converse upon respecting political intrigues. Does he covet wealth? He may visit the royal treasuries and plunder them at his pleasure. Or does he wish for revenge? He can kill his enemy without being detected. In short, he may act as he pleases without fear of discovery. Mazen now said to himself, "This cap can become nobody but me, to whom it will be most advantageous and the object of my expedition. Perhaps it may conduct me to my wife and children, and I may obtain from its possession all I wish. It is certainly one of the wonders of the world and rarities of the age, not to be found among the riches of kings of the present day." When he had ruminated thus, he said, "I am acquainted with the properties of the cap. What are those of the drum?" The second brother began, saying, "Whoever has this drum in his possession, should he be involved in a difficult situation, let him take it out of its case, and with the sticks gently beat upon the characters engraven on the copper. When, if his mind be collected and his courage firm, there will appear to him wonderful matters. The virtue of it consists in the words inscribed upon it, which were written by our Lord Solomon bin David in talismanic characters, each of which has control over certain spirits and princes of the genii, and a power that cannot be described in speech. Hence, whoever is master of this drum may become superior to all the monarchs of the present day, for on his beating it in the manner already described, when he is pressed for help, all the princes of the genii with their sons will appear, also their troops and followers, ready to obey his commands. Whatever he may order them to execute, they will perform by virtue of the talisman of our Lord Solomon bin David." When Mazen of Bussorah had heard the above, he said to himself, "This drum is fitting only for me, as I have much more need of it than the brothers. It will protect me from all evil in the islands of Wak al Wak, should I reach them, and meet with my wife and children. It is true, if I take only the cap, I may be able to enter all places, but this drum will keep injury from me, and with it I shall be secure from all enemies." After this, he said, "I have been informed of the virtues of the cap and the properties of the drum. There now only remains the account of the wooden ball, that I may give judgment between you. Therefore, let the third brother speak." He answered, "To hear is to obey." The third brother said, "My dear uncle, whoever possesses this ball will find in it wonderful properties, for it brings distant parts near and makes near distant. It shortens long journeys and lengthens short ones. If any person wish to perform one of 200 years in 2 days, let him take it from its case, then lay it upon the ground, and mention what place he desires to go. It will instantly be in motion and rush over the earth like the blast of the stormy gale. He must then follow it till he arrives at the place desired, which he will have the power to do with ease." When the youth had conducted his description of the virtue of the wooden ball, Mazen resolved within himself to take this also from the brothers, and said, "If your wish be that I should arbitrate between you, I must first prove the virtues of these 3 articles, and afterwards let each take that which may fall to him by decision." The 3 brothers exclaimed, "We have heard, and we consent. Act as thou thinkest best, and may God protect thee in thy undertakings." Mazen then put on the cap, placed the drum under his vestband, took up the ball and placed it on the ground, when it speeded before him swiftly as the gale. He followed it till it came to the gate of a building, which it entered, and Mazen also went in with it. The brothers ran till they were fatigued and cried out, thou hast sufficiently tried them, but in vain. For by this time there was between him and them the distance of 10 years' journey. Mazen now rested, took the drum in his hands, rubbed his fingers over the talismanic characters, hesitated whether he should strike them with the sticks, then labored lightly upon them, when lo! a voice exclaimed, "Mazen, thou hast gained thy desires." "Thou wilt not, however," continued the voice, "arrive at thy object till after much trouble. But take care of the ball in this spot, for thou art at present in the land of the evil genii." Upon this Mazen took up the ball and concealed it in his clothes, but he was overcome with astonishment at hearing words without seeing the speaker, and exclaimed, "Who art thou, my lord?" "I am," replied the voice, "one of the slaves of the characters which thou seest engraved upon the drum, and unremittingly in attendance. But the other servants will not appear except the drum be beaten loudly, when 360 chiefs will attend thy commands, each of whom has under his authority 10,000 genii, and every individual of them numerous followers." Mazen now inquired the distance of the islands of Wak-al-Wak, to which the voice replied, 3 years' journey, upon which he struck the ball before him and followed it. He next arrived in a region infested by serpents, dragons, and ravenous beasts, in the mountains of which were mines of copper. He now again tabred gently on the drum, when the voice exclaimed, "I am ready to obey thy commands." "Inform me," said Mazen, "what is the name of this country?" "It is called," answered the voice, "the land of dragons and ravenous animals." "Be careful then of thyself, and make no delay, nor regard fatigue, for these mountains are not to be passed without a chance of trouble from the inhabitants, who are genii, and in their caves are furious wild beasts." Upon this he struck the ball afresh, and followed it unceasingly, till at length he reached the seashore and perceived the islands of Wak-al-Wak at the distance, whose mountains appeared of a fiery red, like the sky gilded by the beams of the setting sun. When he beheld them, he was struck with awe and dread, but recovering, he said to himself, "Why should I be afraid, since God has conducted me hither? He will protect me. Or if I die, I shall be relieved from my troubles, and be received into the mercy of God." He then gathered some fruits, which he ate, drank some water, and having performed his devotions, laid himself down to sleep, nor did he awake till the morning. In the morning Mazen had recourse to his drum, which he rubbed gently, when the voice inquired his commands. "How am I," said he, "to pass this sea and enter the islands?" "That is not to be done," replied the voice, "without the assistance of a sage, who resides in a cell on yonder mountains, distant from hence a day's journey. But the ball will conduct thee there in half an hour. When you reach his abode, knock softly at the door, when he will appear, and inquire whence you come and what you want. On entering, he will receive thee kindly, and desire thee to relate thy adventures from beginning to end. Conceal nothing from him, for he alone can assist thee in passing the sea." Mazen then struck the ball, and followed it till he arrived at the abode of the hermit, the gate of which he found locked. He knocked, when a voice from within said, "Who is at the gate?" "A guest," replied Mazen, upon which the sage arose and opened the door, admitted him, and entertained him kindly for a whole night and day, after which Mazen ventured to inquire how he might pass the sea. The sage replied, "What occasions thy searching after such an object?" Mazen answered, "My lord, I intend to enter the islands, and with that view have I traveled far distant from my own country." When the sage heard this, he stood up before him, took a book, opened it, and read in it to himself for some time, every now and then casting a look of astonishment upon Mazen. At length he raised his head and said, "Heavens! What troubles, disasters, and afflictions and exile have been decreed to this youth in search of his object. Upon this Mazen exclaimed, "Wherefore, my lord, did you look at the book, and then at me so earnestly?" The sage replied, "My son, I would instruct thee how to reach the islands, since such is thy desire, but thou canst not succeed in thy desires till after much labor and inconvenience. However, at present relate to me thy adventures, from first to last." Mazen rejoined, "My story, my lord, is such a surprising one, that were it engraven on tablets of adamant, it would be an example for such as would take warning." When he had related his story from beginning to end, the sage exclaimed, "God willing, thou wilt attain thy wishes." Upon which Mazen inquired concerning the sea surrounding the islands, and how he could overcome such an impediment to his progress. When the sage answered, "By God's permission, in the morning we will repair to the mountains, and I will shew thee the wonders of the seas." When God permitted morning to dawn, the hermit arose, took Mazen with him, and they ascended the mountains, till they reached a structure resembling a fortress, which they entered, and proceeded into the inmost court, in which was an immense, colossal statue of brass, hollowed into pipes, having in the midst of it a reservoir lined with marble, the work of magicians. When Mazen beheld this, he was astonished, and began to tremble with fear at the vastness of the statue, and what miraculous power it might contain. The hermit now kindled a fire, threw into it some perfumes, and muttered some unintelligible words, when suddenly dark clouds arose, from which burst out eddies of tempestuous wind, lightnings, claps of thunder, groans, and frightful noises, and in the midst of the reservoir appeared boiling waves, for it was near the ocean surrounding the islands. The hermit did not cease to utter his incantations until the hurricane and noises had subsided by his authority, for he was more powerful than any of the magicians, and had command over the rebellious genii. He now said to Mazen, "Go out and look towards the ocean surrounding the islands." Mazen repaired to the summit of the mountain, and looked towards the sea, but could not discover the smallest trace of its existence. Upon which he was astonished at the miraculous power of the hermit. He returned to him, exclaiming, "I can behold no remains of the ocean, and the islands appear joined to the mainland." When the sage said, "My son, place thy reliance on God, and pursue thy object," after which he vanished from sight. Mazen now proceeded into the islands, and did not stop till he had reached a verdant spot watered by clear rivulets, and shaded by lofty trees. It was now sunrise, and among the wonders which he beheld was a tree like the weeping willow, on which hung, by way of fruit, beautiful damsels, who exclaimed, "Praised be God, our Creator, and former of the islands of Wak al-Wak." They then dropped from the tree and expired. At sight of this prodigy, his senses were confounded, and he exclaimed, "By heavens, this is miraculously surprising." When he had recovered himself, he roamed through the groves, and admired the contrivances of the Almighty till sunset, when he sat down to rest. He had not sat long, when there approached towards him a masculinely looking old woman, of disagreeable countenance, at sight of whom Mazen was alarmed. The matron, guessing that he was in fear of her, said to him, "What is thy name? What are thy wants? Art thou of this country? Inform me. Be not afraid or apprehensive, for I will request of God that I may be the means of forwarding thy wishes." On hearing these words, the heart of Mazen was encouraged, and he re-related to her his adventures from first to last. When she had heard them, she knew that he must be husband to the sister of her mistress, who was queen of the islands of Wak al-Wak, and said, "Thy object is a difficult one, but I will assist thee all in my power." The old woman now conducted Mazen through by-paths to the capital of the island, and led him unperceived in the darkness of night, when the inhabitants had ceased to pass through the streets, to her own house. She then set before him refreshments, and having eaten and drunk till he was satisfied, he praised God for his arrival. When the matron informed him concerning his wife, that she had endured great troubles and afflictions since her separation, and repented sincerely of her flight. Upon hearing this, Mazen wept bitterly, and fainted with anguish. When revived by the exertions of the old woman, she comforted him by promises of speedy assistance to complete his wishes, and left him to his repose. Next morning, the old woman, desiring Mazen to wait patiently for her return, repaired to the palace, where she found the queen and her sisters in consultation concerning the wife of Mazen, and saying, "This wretch has espoused a man, by whom she has children, but now she is returned. We will put her to death after diverse tortures." Upon the entrance of the old lady they arose, saluted her with great respect, and seated her, for she had been their nurse. When she had rested a little, she said, "Were you not conversing about your unfortunate sister? But can ye reverse the decrees of God?" "Dear nurse," replied they, "no one can avoid the will of heaven, and had she wedded one of our own nature, there would have been no disgrace. But she has married a human being of Bussorah, and has children by him, so that our species will despise us, and tauntingly say, 'Your sister is a harlot.' Her death is therefore not to be avoided." The nurse rejoined, "If you put her to death, your scandal will be greater than hers, for she was wedded lawfully, and her offspring is legitimate. But I wish to see her." The eldest sister answered, "She is now confined in a subterraneous dungeon." Upon which the nurse requested permission to visit her, which was granted, and one of the sisters attended to conduct her to the prison. The nurse, on her arrival at the prison, found the wife of Mazen in great distress from the cruelty of her sisters. Her children were playing about her, but very pallid, from the closeness of their confinement. On the entrance of the nurse, she stood up, made her obeisance, and began to weep, saying, "My dear nurse, I have been long in this dungeon, and know not what in the end may be my fate." The old woman kissed her cheeks and said, "My dear daughter, God will bring thee relief, perchance on this very day." When the wife of Mazen heard this, she said, "Good heavens, your words, my dear nurse, recall a gleam of comfort that last night struck across my mind from a voice which said, 'Be comforted, O wife of Mazen, for thy deliverance is near.'" Upon this the old woman replied, "Thou shalt indeed be comforted, for thy husband is at my abode, and will speedily release thee." The unfortunate prisoner, overcome with joy, fainted away, but was soon restored by the nurse's sprinkling water upon her face, and when she opened her eyes and said, "I conjure thee by heaven, my dear nurse, inform me if thou speakest truth, or dissemblest." "I not only speak truth," answered the nurse, "but by God's help thou shalt meet thy husband this day." After this she left her. The nurse, upon her return home, inquired of Mazen if he had skill to take his wife away, provided he was admitted into the dungeon at night. He replied, "Yes." When night was set in, she conducted him to the spot where she was confined, left him near the gate, and went her way. He then put on his cap of invisibility, and remained unperceived all night by anyone. Early in the morning, the queen, his wife's eldest sister, advanced, opened the gate of the prison, and entered, when he followed unseen behind her, and seated himself in a corner of the apartment. The queen went up to her sister, and beat her cruelly with a whip, while her children wept around her, till the blood appeared upon her body, when she left her hanging by her hair from a pillar, went out, and locked the door of the dungeon. Mazen now arose, unloosened his wife's hair, and pulling off the cap, appeared before her, when she exclaimed, "From whence didst thou come? They then embraced each other, and he said, "Ah, why didst thou act thus, leave me in such affliction, and plunge thyself into such distress, which indeed thy conduct hath almost deserved?" "It is true," replied she, "but what is past, and reproach will not avail unless thou canst effect our escape." Upon which he exclaimed, "Does thy inclination really lead thee to accompany me to my own country?" She answered, "Yes, do with me what thou choosest." They remained in endearment with their children until evening, when the keeper of the dungeon approaching, Mazen put on his cap of invisibility. The keeper, having set down the provisions for the night, retired into a recess of the dungeon and fell asleep, when Mazen and his family sat down and refreshed themselves. Perceiving the keeper asleep, Mazen tried the door and found it unlocked, upon which he and his wife and children left the prison and traveled as quickly as possible all night. When the queen, in the morning, was informed of her sister's escape, she was enraged and made incantations, on which 7,000 genii attended, with whom she marched out in pursuit, resolved to cut the fugitives in pieces. Mazen, looking behind him, perceived a cloud of dust, and soon appeared the forces of his wife's sister, who cried out on seeing him with dreadful howls, "Where will ye go, ye wretches, ye accursed? Where can ye hide yourselves?" Upon this Mazen took out his drum and beat it violently, when lo, there appeared before him legions of genii, in number more than could be reckoned, and they fought with the armies of the queen, who was taken prisoner with her principal attendants. When the wife of Mazen beheld her sister in this distress, her compassion was moved towards her, and she said to her husband, "Hurt not my sister, nor use her ill, for she is my elder." Upon which he treated her respectfully and commanded tents to be pitched for her and her court. Peace being established, the sisters took an affectionate leave, and Mazen with his family departed for the residence of Ab al-Sulib, which they speedily reached with the assistance of the genii and the directing ball. The old man received him kindly and inquired of his adventures, when he related them to him, at which he was surprised, especially at the account of the cap, the drum, and the ball, of which last Mazen begged his acceptance, being now near home, and having no farther occasion for its use. Ab al-Sulib was much pleased, and entertained him magnificently for 3 days. When Mazen, wishing to depart, the old man presented him with rich gifts, and dismissed him. Mazen was continuing his route, when suddenly a band of 100 banditti appeared, resolved to plunder and put him and his companions to death, with which design they kept advancing. Mazen called out to them, "Brother Arabs, let the covenant of God be between you and me. Keep at a distance from me." When they heard this, they increased their insolence, surrounded him, and supposed they would seize easily all that he had, but especially when they beheld his wife, and the beauty she was endowed with, they said one to another, "Let us put him to death, and not suffer him to live." Each man resolved within himself, saying, "I will seize this damsel, and not take the plunder." When Mazen saw that they were bent upon attacking him, to seize his wife and plunder his effects, he took out his drum, and beat upon it in a slight manner, when behold, 10 genii appeared before him, requiring his commands. He replied, "I wish the dispersion of yonder horsemen." Upon which one of the 10 advanced among the 100 banditti, and uttered such a tremendous yell as made the mountains reverberate the sound. Immediately, as he had sent forth the yell, the banditti, in alarm, dispersed themselves among the rocks, when such as fell from their horses' backs fled on foot, so that they lost their reputation and were ridiculed among the chiefs of the Abyssinian tribes. Mazen now pursued his journey, and did not halt till he had reached the abode of Ab al-Quddus, who advanced to meet him and saluted him, but was astonished when he beheld his company, and the wealth he had obtained. Mazen related what had befallen him, of dangers and hunger and thirst, his safe arrival in the islands of Wak-al-Wak, the deliverance of his wife from prison, and the defeat of the army sent to oppose his return. He mentioned also the reconciliation between the sisters of his wife, and whatever had happened to him from first to last. Ab-el-Quddus was greatly astonished at these adventures, and said to Mazen of Bussorah, "Truly, my son, these events are most surprising, and can have never occurred to any but thyself." Mazen remained 3 days to repose himself, and was treated with hospitality and respect until the 4th, when he resolved to continue his journey, and took leave. He proceeded towards his own country, and did not halt on the way till he arrived with the 7 sisters, the owners of the palace, who had so much befriended him. When Mazen of Bussorah arrived near the palace of the 7 sisters, they came out to meet him, saluted him and his wife, and conducted them within. But they were astonished at his return, and at first could scarcely believe his success, wondering that he had not perished on the road, or been torn in pieces by the wild beasts of the desert, for they regarded it as impossible that he should ever reach the islands of Wak-al-Wak. When they were seated, they requested him to relate to them all that had befallen him, which he did from first to last, and they were more than ever astonished at his uncommon adventures. After this they introduced a collation, and spread the cloth, when they ate, till they were satisfied, and then wrote a letter and dispatched it to the mother of Mazen, congratulating her on the health of her son and his safe return with his wife and children. Mazen remained with the ladies a month, enjoying himself in feasting and amusements, after which he begged permission to depart to his own country, for his heart was anxious for his mother. They dismissed him, and he traveled unceasingly till he arrived in Bussorah. He entered the city at sunset, and proceeded to his own house, when his mother came out, saluted him, and embraced him. She had erected her tomb in the court of her house, and had wept night and day, till she became blind. But when the letter arrived from the sisters, from the rapture of joy her sight returned unto her again. She beheld the children of her son, embraced them, and that night was to her as an Eid or festival. When God had caused the morning to dawn, the chief personages of Bussorah visited Mazen to congratulate him on his return, and the principal ladies came to his mother and rejoiced with her on the safety of her son. At length intelligence of it reached the Caliph, Harun al-Rashid, who sent for Mazen to his presence. Having entered the audience chamber, he made the usual obeisance, and when the Caliph returned his salute and commanded him to sit. When he was seated, the Caliph demanded that he should relate the whole of what had befallen him, to which he answered, "To hear is to obey." Mazen then recited his adventures, from the time the fire worshipper who had stolen him from his mother by his stratagems, the mode of his coming to the palace of the 7 ladies, the manner in which he obtained his wife, her flight from the palace of the Empress Zobeide, his journey to the islands of Wak-al-Wak, also the dangers and difficulties he had encountered from first to last. The Caliph was astonished, and said, "The substance of these adventures must not be lost or concealed, but shall be recorded in writing." He then commanded an amanuensis to attend, and seated Mazen of Bussorah by him, until he had taken down his adventures from beginning to end. End of section 42.
Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 43. Story of the Sultan, the Dervish, and the Barber's Son. In the capital of a sultan named Ramad lived a barber, who had a son growing up to manhood, possessing great accomplishments of mind and person, and whose wit and humor drew numerous customers to his shop. One day a venerable dervish entering it, sat down, and calling for a looking-glass, adjusted his beard and whiskers, at the same time asking many questions of the young man, after which he laid down a sharif, rose up, and departed. The next day he came again, and for several days following, always finishing his visit by leaving a piece of gold upon the looking-glass, to the great satisfaction of the barber, who from his other customers never usually received more than sonic coppers of little value. But though he liked the gold, his suspicions were raised against the generous donor, supposing him to be a necromancer, who had some evil design against his son, whom, therefore, he cautioned to be upon his guard. The visits of the dervish were continued as usual for some time, when one day he found the barber's son alone in the shop, and was informed that his father had gone to divert himself with viewing some experiments which the Sultan was making of the mixture of various metals, being an adept in chemistry, and eager in search of the philosopher's stone. The dervish now invited the young man to accompany him to the spot where the experiments were making, and on their arrival they saw a vast furnace, which within the Sultan and the descendants cast pieces of metal of various sorts. The dervish, having taken up a lump of ore from his wallet, threw it into the furnace. Then, addressing the young barber, said, "I must for the present bid you farewell, as I have a journey to take, but if the Sultan should inquire after me, let him know I am to be found in a certain city, and will attend his summons." Having said this, the dervish presented the barber's son with a purse of gold, took his leave, and the youth returned home. Great was the surprise of the Sultan, when the metals in the furnace were all melted, to find them converted into a mass of solid gold, which proved, on essay, to be the purest quality. Every one was questioned as to what he had cast into the furnace, when there appeared no reason to suppose the transmutation could have been effected by such an accidental mixture of metals. At length it was remarked that a dervish, accompanying the barber's son, had cast a lump of ore, and immediately disappeared. Upon this the Sultan summoned the youth to his presence, and inquiring after his companion, was informed of the place of his residence, and of what, on his departure, he had said to him. The Sultan was overjoyed at the welcome intelligence, and dispatched the young man, with an honorable attendance, to conduct the venerable dervish to his presence, where, being arrived, he was received with the most distinguishing attention, and the barber's son was promoted to high office. After some days, the Sultan requested the dervish to instruct him in the transmutation of metals, which he readily did, as well as in many other occult mysteries, which so gratified his royal patron that he trusted the administration of government to his care. This disgusted the ministers and courtiers, who could not bear to be controlled by a stranger, and therefore resolved to effect his ruin. By degrees they persuaded their credulous master that the dervish was a magician, who would in time possess himself of his throne, and the Sultan, alarmed, resolved to put him to death. With this intention, calling him to the presence, he accused him of sorcery, and commanded an executioner to strike off his head. "Forbear a while," exclaimed the dervish, "and let me live till I have shown you the most wonderful specimen of my art." To this the Sultan consented, when the dervish, with chalk, drew a circle of considerable extent around the Sultan and his attendants. Then, stepping into the middle of it, he drew a small circle around himself, and said, "Now seize me if you can," and immediately disappeared from sight. At the same instant the Sultan and his couriers found themselves assaulted by invisible agents, who, tearing off their robes, whipped them with scourges till the blood flowed in streams from their lacerated backs. At length the punishment ceased, but the mortification of the Sultan did not end here, for all the gold which the dervish had transmuted returned to its original metals. Thus, by his unjust credulity, was a weak prince punished for his ungrateful folly. The barber and his son also were never to be found, so that the Sultan could gain no intelligence of the dervish, and he and his courtiers became the laughing-stock of the populace for years after their merited chastisement. End of section 43.
Translated by Jonathan Scott, Section 44, Adventures of Alifa, daughter of Merjorn, Sultan of Hind, and Yosef, son of Sol, Sultan of Sind. Merjorn, Sultan of Hind, was many years without any progeny, and immersed in melancholy at the thought of his kingdom's passing to another family. One evening, while indulging his gloomy thoughts, he dropped into a doze, from which he was roused by a voice exclaiming, "Sultan, thy wife this night shall conceive. If she bears a son, he will increase the glory of thy house, but if a daughter, she will occasion thee disgrace and misfortune." In due time the favourite sultana was delivered of a daughter, to the great mortification of the parents, who would have destroyed her had not her infant smiles diverted their anger. She was brought up in the strictest privacy, and at the end of 12 years the Sultan had her conveyed to a strong citadel erected in the middle of a deep lake, hoping in such a confinement to prevent her from fulfilling the prediction which had been made concerning her. Nothing could excel the magnificence of her abode, where she was left only with female attendants of the highest accomplishments, but no male was allowed to approach even the borders of the lake, except when supplies were conveyed for the use of its fair inhabitants, who were then restricted to their apartments. The gate of the citadel was entrusted to the care of an old lady, the princess's nurse. For 3 years the fair Alifa lived happily in her splendid prison, but the decree of fate was not to be overcome, and an event predestined by heaven overturned the cautious project of Sultan Meherjon. Yusuf, a dissipated young prince, son to the Sultan of Sind, having offended his father, fled from his court, and with a few attendants reached the borders of the lake, in his way to seek an asylum in the territories of Meherjon. Curious to know who inhabited the citadel in the midst of it, he swam over the lake and landed at the gate, which he found shut, but no one answered his loudest call for admission. Upon this he wrote a note, requesting compassion to a helpless stranger, and having fixed it to an arrow, shot it over the battlements. It luckily for him fell at the feet of the princess, then walking in one of the courts of her palace. She prevailed upon her nurse to open the gate, and at sight of Yusuf fell in love with him, as he did with her. He was admitted, and the tenderest interviews took place between them. Joy and pleasure prevailed in the citadel, while the prince's attendants remained, expecting his return, on the banks of the lake. After some time, Sultan Sul, wishing to be reconciled to his son, and having learnt the route he had taken, dispatched his nephew named Year to assure him of forgiveness and invite him to return to Sind. Year, arriving at the lake, was informed by Yusuf's attendants that the prince had entered the citadel, since which they had not seen or heard anything of him. Year, upon this, penned a note expressive of the Sultan's forgiveness and his wish to see the prince, which he fixed to an arrow and shot it into the palace, in the garden of which it fell, as Yusuf and Alifa were walking for their amusement. The prince, on reading the note, overcome with joy at the intelligence of his father's forgiveness of his errors, resolved to return home and pay his duty to his parents. He communicated his design to the princess, who was plunged into the deepest sorrow at the thought of his departure, but he comforted her by assurances of his speedy return, declaring that nothing but filial duty could have torn him from her, even for a moment. She now implored him to take her with him, but Yusuf prudently represented that such a step could only disgrace her fame and enrage her father, who on discovery of her flight would invade the kingdom of Sind with his powerful armies, and a scene of unnecessary bloodshed would ensue. On the contrary, if they waited patiently, Sultan Meherjon might be prevailed upon to consent to their union, but in the meantime he would visit her often, while their meetings might, through the fidelity of their mutual attendants, be kept secret. Alifa, though unwilling, was obliged to acknowledge the justice of his reasoning, and consented to his departure. but on his taking leave, with tears and embraces entreated him not to be long absent, which he promised, and with truth, for his love was sincere, and it was with difficulty he submitted to the call of duty to a forgiving parent. Yosef, having swam the lake with his bow and quiver upon his head as before, rejoined his companions, who rejoiced to see him. He was received by his cousin Year with transports of affection, and informed of what had happened since his departure from court. After which the prince related his love adventure with the fair Alifa, at the same time requesting his secrecy, and that he would charge the same on his attendants as to his having been in the citadel, which he should earnestly beg also of his companions to observe. After a night's repose, the two princes marched towards Sind, and when within a day's distance from the capital, dispatched a courier to give notice of their approach. Sultan Sul, overcome with joy at the recovery of his son, having commanded the city to be ornamented and splendid entertainments to be made for his triumphal entry, with his whole court in their most magnificent array, advanced to meet him. The prince, on seeing his father's train, dismounted, fell on his face, then running up, eagerly embraced the stirrup of the old sultan, who threw himself upon his neck in a transport of joy, and wept over him with tears of affectionate rapture. A horse, sumptuously caparisoned, was now brought for the prince's mounting, and the father and son rode side by side into the city, amid the acclamations of all ranks of people, while, as they proceeded, basins full of silver and gold, coined for the occasion, were showered amongst the assembled crowds in the streets. It is impossible to describe the tender interview between the prince and the queen his mother, whose heart had been nearly broken on the flight of her son, or the glad transports of Yosef's own ladies, who were in number 3 wives and 40 concubines. Suffice it to say that all was joy and pleasure in the palace, except in the breast of Yosef, who mingled with the satisfaction of return to his family an ardent desire to meet again the beautiful Alifa, so that the caresses of his women gave him no pleasure, and when he retired to his apartment he did not, as was usual, call any of them to his presence, but passed the night alone, thinking of his beloved. Morning invited him to new scenes of festivity, prepared by his happy parents, who little suspected how soon they were again to lose their son. Yosef, having sacrificed a few days, to him as long as the eve of dissolution, to his sense of duty, could no longer restrain his impatience, but with a faithful slave named Holol, mounted on a favourite courser behind him, left the palace undiscovered in the darkness of night, and speeded with the swiftness of the gale towards the citadel of Alifa. Being arrived on the banks of the lake, he secured his saddle and bridle among some bushes, and was carried with his attendant safely through the water by his noble steed. Unbounded was the joy of the princess at again meeting her faithful lover, nor was his rapture less than hers. Having committed Halol to the care of the ladies of Alifa, they retired to their apartment. 30 days rolled on, almost unperceived by Yosef, who forgot his parents, his family, and country in the delights of love. On the 30th evening, as Yosef and Alifa were viewing the beautiful prospect from the terrace of the palace, they perceived a boat sailing towards it, which as it drew nearer the princess knew to belong to her father, the Sultan Merjorn, upon which she requested her lover to keep himself concealed from view while she received the persons in the vessel. Yosef accordingly withdrew into a chamber, the lattice of which looked upon the lake. But how can we express his indignant surprise and furious jealousy when he beheld landing from the boat 2 handsome young men, into the arms of one of whom Alifa threw herself with eager transport, and after mutual embraces they withdrew together into the palace. Without considering that his supposed rival might be a near relation to the princess, as he in fact was, being her first cousin, who had been brought up with her till her confinement to the lake, Yusuf suffered himself to be overcome by unworthy suspicion, and resolved to quit forever a faithless mistress. Having written an angry letter upbraiding her with falsehood, and bidding her farewell, he with his attendant Halul mounted his courser, then, delivering his note to one of the females to be given to the princess, he swam over the lake and speeded rapidly to his own country, where he was once more joyfully received by his parents and family. And in order to forget the charms of Elipha, he indulged himself in mirth and pleasure with his lately forsaken ladies, who, delighted with the long-wished-for return of his affection, strove with each other who should please him best. The unsuspecting Elipha was engaged with her cousin Saul and Ali bin Ibrahim, a faithful eunuch who was his attendant, asking 1,000 questions and listening to the news of her father's court, when Yusuf's letter was put into her hands. Rising up, she withdrew into a closet, opened it, and was much vexed at its ungrateful contents. But knowing herself innocent, and trusting that her lover would return when convinced of his mistake, she composed her mind as firmly as she could till the departure of her cousin, who after some days took leave and returned to the capital of Merjourn, leaving behind him the eunuch, to the great satisfaction of the princess, who hoped to make him the mediator between her and her beloved. Nor was she mistaken. When unfolding to him the whole of her adventures with Yusuf, he agreed to be the bearer of a letter, and explained to him the cause of his needless suspicion. Having swam the lake with the fair Elipha's packet, wrapped in his clothes upon his head, the faithful Ali in 20 days reached the city of Sind, and demanding an audience in private, which was readily granted, delivered his commission to the prince. Yusuf, whose anger was now calmed, and who had already begun to feel uneasy at absence from the still reigning favourite of his heart, on perusing her letter was overcome with joy. He listened eagerly to the account of his fancied rival by the eloquent Ali bin Ibrahim, to whom he expressed his conviction of her constancy, his own sorrow for his unreasonable desertion of her, and his intention of departing to visit her the next night, till when he desired the eunuch to repose himself after his fatigue. Ali bin Ibrahim was then lodged, by the prince's orders, in one of the most splendid apartments of the palace, and respectfully waited upon by the domestics of his court. The night following, Yusuf, having ordered his favourite Hulul to make preparations, departed from Sind as before, with the eunuch mounted on a second courser. They, in a few days, reached the borders of the lake, swam over, and to the great joy of the once more happy Elipha arrived at the citadel. The recollection of the pains of absence added a zest to the transports of reunion, and the lovers were, if possible, more delighted with each other than before their separation. The faithful Ali bin Ibrahim was now dismissed, with invaluable presents of precious stones, and returned to the court of Merjourn, the time for his stay at the citadel of the lake being expired. On his arrival, the Sultan, anxious for intelligence of his daughter's health, took him into his closet, and while he was questioning him, by some accident the eunuch's turban unfortunately falling off, the precious stones, which, with a summary of the adventures of Yusuf and Elipha, and his own embassy to Sind, were wrapped in the folds, tumbled upon the floor. The Sultan knew the jewels, and examining the turban to make further discoveries, found the paper which he eagerly read, and furious was his wrath, when from the contents it appeared that all his caution to guard against the decrees of heaven had been in vain, that the princess had been seduced, and his house dishonoured. He sternly inquired of the trembling Ali if Yusuf was yet with his daughter, and was answered in the affirmative, when he immediately gave orders for vessels to be prepared for his departure, hoping to take him prisoner, and at the same time commanded his army to march along the banks of the lake and encamp opposite the citadel. The unfortunate eunuch was thrown into a dungeon and loaded with heavy chains, after he had been bastinadoed almost to death. But still faithful to the lovers, he prevailed upon his jailer by a large bribe during the night to permit him to dispatch a note by a trusty messenger to the princess, apprising her of the misfortune which had happened, in hopes that she would have time to escape with Yosef towards his own country before her father's arrival. Fortunately for the lovers, this information reached them the next morning, when they consulted what measures to pursue, and it was agreed that instead of both quitting the citadel, only Yosef and Halol should return to Sind, as the princess was unequal to such a rapid journey, but that in order to ensure her safety, the slaves should, on the Sultan's arrival, assure him that she had gone off with her lover, when he would either return home or pursue the prince with his army, who, however, mounted as he was on so swift a courser, could not be overtaken. It was also settled that Yosef, on his arrival in his own country, should send an embassy to Merjourn declaring his marriage with Alifa, and requesting pardon and leave to pay his duty as his son-in-law. This stratagem had in part its effect, but no precaution could ward off the fulfilment of the prediction at the princess's birth, which was that she should occasion the disgrace and death of her father. Merjourn, armed at the citadel a few hours after Yosef's escape, was informed by her attendants that she had also accompanied him in his flight, upon which the enraged Sultan, hurried on by fate, without stopping to search the palace in which his daughter was concealed, hastened to join his troops on the banks of the lake, and with a vast army pursued the Scindian prince, who, however, reached his capital in safety. On his arrival, having informed his father of his adventures, the old Sultan, eager to gratify his son, approved of his additional marriage with the fair Alifa, and dispatched an embassy to Merjourn, who by this time was in the territory of Sind, laying it waste with fire and sword, no troops scarcely being opposed to his sudden invasion. He received the ambassador with mortifying haughtiness, bidding him return to his master, and inform him that he never would forgive the seduction of his daughter, in revenge for which he had taken a solemn oath to overturn the kingdom of Sind, raze the capital, and feast his eyes with the blood of the old Sultan and his son. On receipt of this ungracious reply to his proposals, the Sultan and Yosef had no alternative but to oppose so inveterate a foe. They collected their troops, by whom they were much beloved, and marched to meet the enemy, whom, after an obstinate battle, they defeated, and Merjourn was slain in the action. It is impossible to resist the decrees of heaven. From God we came, and to God we must return. Yosef, after the action, behaved with the greatest humility to the conquered, and had the body of the unfortunate Merjourn embalmed and laid in a splendid litter, in which it was conducted by a numerous escort in respectful solemnity to the capital of Hind, and deposited with funeral pomp, becoming the rank of the deceased, in a magnificent mausoleum which had been erected by himself, as is customary among the sovereigns of Asia. The prince at the same time dispatched letters of condolence to the mother of Alifa, lamenting the fate of Merjourn, whom he had been, much against his will, necessitated to oppose in battle, and expressing his ardent love for her daughter, a marriage with whom was his highest hope, as it was his first wish to console the mother of his beloved in her misfortunes. The Sultana, who had received intelligence of the decisive victory and the death of her husband, and who expected, instead of such conduct, to see the victor besieging her capital, felt some alleviation of her sorrow in the prospect of saving her people from destruction, by consenting to a union between Yusuf and Alifa. Her answer accordingly was favourable, upon which the Prince of Sind repaired to the lake, and conducting his willing bride to the capital of Hind, at the expiration of the stated time of mourning for Meerjorn, their nuptials were celebrated with all possible magnificence, amid the united acclamations of the subjects, who readily acknowledged his authority, and had no cause to repent of their submission to his yoke. His next care was to inform the Caliph Mamun, who was then commander of the faithful at Baghdad, of the events which had happened, accompanying his petition with a great sum of money and offerings of all the rarities the countries of Hind and Sind afforded, among which were 10 beautiful slaves, highly accomplished in singing, dancing, and a talent for poetry. They recited extempore verses before the Caliph, but the subject of each was so expressive of their wish to return to their beloved sovereign, and delivered in so affecting a manner, that Mamun, though delighted with their wit and beauty, sacrificed his own pleasure to their feelings, and sent them back to Yusuf by the officer who carried the edict, confirming him in his dominions, where the Prince of Sind and the fair Alifa continued long, amid a numerous progeny, to live the protectors of their happy subjects. End of section 44. Recordings by Kurt Bruss, Bogota, Colombia.
The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4, translated by Jonathan Scott, Section 45. Adventures of the Three Princes, Sons of the Sultan of China. A sultaness of China, being seized with an alarming illness, was given over by the physicians, who declared her case incurable by any other means than the water of life, which they feared it was next to impossible to obtain before nature would be exhausted, the country in which, if anywhere, it was to be found being so very distant. Such, however, was the affection of the Sultaness's 3 sons, that, in hopes of saving their mother, they resolved to go in search of the precious medicine, and departed immediately in the route pointed out by the physicians. After travelling without success to their inquiries through divers countries, they agreed to separate, in hopes that one of them at least might be fortunate enough to procure the wished for miraculous liquid, and return home in time to save their mother. Having taken an affectionate farewell, each pursued his journey alone. The eldest son, after a fatiguing walk, for the brothers had thought it prudent to lay aside their dignity and as safest to disguise themselves in mean habits, over a wild country, arrived at last within sight of a large city inhabited by blasphemous Jews, near which, in a superb synagogue, he laid himself down on a carpet to repose, being quite exhausted with toil and hunger. He had not rested long when a Jew rabbi, entering the building, the prince begged for the love of God a little refreshment. But the wicked infidel, who hated true believers, instead of relieving, cruelly put him to death with his sabre, and wrapping the corpse in a mat, threw it into the corner of the synagogue. By ill fortune, on the day following, the second prince arrived, and was treated in the same manner by the barbarous Jew. And on the next came also the youngest brother to the same place, where he was met by the base assassin, who would have killed him also, had not the extraordinary beauty of the young prince struck his covetous mind with the idea of making him a slave, and selling him for a large sum of money. Speaking therefore to him in a kind manner, he brought him refreshments, and inquired if he was willing to be his servant, and employ himself in cleaning the synagogue and lighting the lamps, to which the prince, being in an exhausted condition, seemingly assented, seeing no other means of present support, but secretly resolved to escape when recovered from his fatigue. The Jew now took him to his house in the city and showed him, apparently, the same tenderness as he used towards his own children. The next day the prince repaired to his allotted task of cleaning the synagogue, where, to his grief and horror, he presently discovered the bodies of his unfortunate brothers. While he lamented their unhappy fate with showers of tears, the recollection of his own perilous situation in the power of their murderer filled his mind with terror. But after the agonies of thought were over, the natural courage of a princely heart rose in his bosom, and he meditated how to avenge the death of his brothers on the savage infidel. An opportunity happened that same night. The prince, having composed his mind, finished his work, and when the Jew arrived to examine it, dissembled so well that no appearance of his inward melancholy was displayed. The Jew applauded his diligence, and taking him home, made him sit down to supper with himself and family, consisting of a wife and two young lads. It being the middle of summer, and the weather sultry, they retired to sleep on the open terrace of the house, which was very lofty. In the dead of night, when the Jew and his family were fast locked in the arms of slumber, the prince, who had purposely kept himself awake, seized the sabre of the treacherous infidel, and with a dexterous blow struck off his head. Then, snatching up the two children, hurled them headlong from the terrace, so that their brains were dashed out on the stone pavement of the court below. He then uplifted the sabre to destroy the Jew's wife, but the thought that she might be of use to him withheld his hand. He awoke her gently, commanded her to make no noise, and follow him downstairs, where, by degrees, he informed her of his adventures, the discovery he had made of the murder of his brothers, and his revenge on her treacherous husband and ill fated children, whom, however, he would not have destroyed had he not been apprehensive of their cries alarming the neighborhood. The Mussulman woman, for such she secretly was, did not regard the death of the wicked Jew, who had married her against her will and often used her with great harshness, and her sorrows for the children were softened by the salvation of her own life. She also felt sentiments of tenderness towards the prince, whose injuries in the murder of his unfortunate brothers had compelled him to revenge, and felt herself obliged to his mercy in letting her live. She now informed him that in the Jew's laboratory were many valuable medicines, and among them the very water of life he was in search of, which intelligence was most gratifying to the prince, who offered to take the woman under his protection, and she willingly consented to accompany him to a country inhabited by true believers. Having packed up the medicines with some valuable jewels, and put them with various refreshments and necessaries on two camels, they mounted and left the city undiscovered. Nor did any accident occur on their journey. But on reaching the capital of China, the prince found that his father was dead, while his mother, contrary to expectation, lingered in painful existence. The ministers, who had with difficulty, in hopes of the three brothers' arrival, kept the next relations of the throne from disputing their right to ascend it, were rejoiced at his return, and on being informed of the untimely end of the two elder princes, immediately proclaimed him Sultan. His first care was to administer comfort and relief to his afflicted mother, on whom the water of life had an instantaneous effect. His next, to regulate the affairs of his government, which he did with such ability, justice, and moderation, that he became endeared to his subjects, and an example to other sovereigns. As the Sultan, some time after his accession, was one day amusing himself in the chase, he saw a venerable Arab, accompanied by his daughter, travelling on horseback. By accident, the young female's veil being blown aside displayed such beauty to the eyes of the Sultan as instantly fascinated his heart and made him wish to have her for his Sultana. He immediately made offers to her father of his alliance, but great was his mortification and surprise when the Arab rejected them, saying that he had sworn not to give his daughter to anyone who was not master of some useful trade by which a livelihood might be earned. "Father," replied the Sultan, "what occasion is there that I should learn a mean occupation when I have the wealth of a kingdom at my command?" "Because," rejoined the Arab, "such are the vicissitudes of the world that you may lose your kingdom and starve, if not able to work in some way for your living." The Sultan, unlike some princes who would have seized the lady and punished the Arab for his freedom, felt the force of his remark, applauded his wisdom, and requested that he would not betroth her to another, as he was resolved to make himself worthy of becoming his son in law by learning some handicraft, till when he hoped they would accept an abode near the palace. To this the old man readily consented, and in a short time the Sultan, eager to possess his bride, became such an adept in the handicraft of making ornamental mats for sofas and cushions of cane and reeds that the Arab agreed to the nuptials, which were celebrated with all possible splendor and rejoicing, while the subjects admired more than ever the justice and moderation of their sovereign. So true is it that, unless in depraved states, a good prince makes a good people. Some years rolled on in uninterrupted felicity to the Sultan and his beloved partner. It was the custom of the former frequently to visit in the disguise of a dervish the various quarters of the city, by which means he learned the opinions of the people and inspected the conduct of the police. One day in an excursion of this sort he passed by a cook's shop, and being hungry, stepped in to take some refreshment. He was, with seeming respect, conducted to a back room spread with flowered carpeting, over which was a covering of muslin transparently fine. Pulling off his slippers, he entered the room and sat down upon a neat musnad. But to his surprise and terror it instantly sank under him, and he found himself at the bottom of a dark vault, where by a glimmering light he could discern several naked bodies of unfortunate persons who had been murdered. And presently appeared, descending from a narrow staircase, a black slave of savage countenance, who, brandishing a huge scimitar, cried out, "Wretch, prepare thyself to die!" The Sultan was alarmed, but his presence of mind did not forsake him. "What good," said he, "will my death do you or your employers? I have nothing about me but the humble habit I wear. But, if you spare my life, I possess an art that will produce your employers considerable wealth." Upon this, the slave, going to the master of the house, informed him of what the supposed dervish had said, when the treacherous cook came in to inquire after the promised riches. "Give me only some reeds and canes, varnished of different colors," said the Sultan, "and I will make a mat, which if you carry to the palace and present to the vizier, he will purchase it for 1,000 pieces of gold." The desired articles were furnished, and the Sultan, setting to work, in a few days finished a mat, in which he ingeniously contrived to plate in flowery characters, known only to himself and his vizier, the account of his situation. When finished, he gave it to his treacherous host, who admired the beauty of the workmanship, and not doubting of the reward, carried it to the palace, where he demanded admission, saying he had a curiosity to offer for sale. The vizier, who was then giving audience to petitioners, commanded him to be brought in. But what was his astonishment when the mat was unfolded, to see, portrayed upon it, the imminent danger of the Sultan, whom he supposed to be in his harem, and whose absence the Sultana had, in order to prevent confusion, commanded to be kept secret, hoping for his speedy return. The vizier instantly summoned his guards, seized the villainous cook, and proceeding to his house, released the sultan from his confinement. The house was razed to the ground, and the abominable neighbor, with his guilty family, put to death. The sultan exultingly felt the use of having learned a useful art which had been the means of saving his life. End of section 45.
4 translated by Jonathan Scott. Story of the Good Vizier unjustly imprisoned. A certain vizier, though perfectly loyal and of strictest integrity, having been falsely accused by his enemies, was, without due examination of the charges brought against him, thrown into prison, where, by orders from the Sultan, he was confined to a gloomy dungeon and allowed only bread and water for his daily food. In this wretched abode he lay for 7 years, at the expiration of which the Sultan, his master, who was in the habit of walking about the city in disguise to amuse himself, chanced to pass by the house of his injured minister, dressed as a dervish. To his surprise he saw it open, and a crowd of domestics busy in cleaning the apartments and preparing for the reception of the owner, who, they said, had commanded them by a messenger from the prison to put things in orders, as he should that day be restored to the Sultan's favour, and returned home. The Sultan, who, so far from intending to release the unfortunate vizier, had almost erased the remembrance of him from his mind, was astonished at the report of the domestics, but thought his long confinement might possibly have disturbed the brain of his prisoner, who in his madness might have fancied his deliverance to be at hand. He resolved, however, to go and visit the prison, disguised as he was, and see the vizier. Having purchased a quantity of bread and cakes, he proceeded to the gaol, and requested, under pretence of fulfilling a vow he had made to feed the prisoners, to be admitted and allowed to distribute his charity among them. The gaoler granted his request, and permitted him to visit the different cells. At length he came to that of the vizier, who was employed earnestly at his devotions, which on the entrance of the supposed dervish he suspended, and inquired his business. "I come," said he, "for though unknown to you I have always prayed for your welfare, to congratulate you on your approaching deliverance, which I understand you have announced to your domestics, but fear without foundation, not having heard of any orders for the purpose from the Sultan." "That may be true, charitable dervish," said the vizier, "but depend upon it before night I shall be released and restored to office." "I wish it may be so," replied the Sultan. "But upon what ground do you build an expectation, the gratification of which appears to me is so improbable?" "Be seated, good dervish, and I will tell you," rejoined the vizier, and began as follows. "Know then, my friend, experience has convinced me that the height of prosperity is always quickly succeeded by adverse fortune, and the depth of affliction by sudden relief. When I was in office, beloved by the people for my lenient administration, and distinguished by the Sultan, whose honour and advantage were the constant objects of my care, and for whose welfare I have never ceased to pray even in this gloomy dungeon, I was one evening taking the air upon the river in a splendid barge with some favourite companions. As we were drinking coffee, the cup I held in my hand, which was made of a single emerald of immense value, and which I highly prized, slipped from it and fell into the water, upon which I ordered the barge to be stopped, and sent for a diver, to whom I promised an ample reward should he recover the cup. He undressed, and desired me to point out the place at which it fell, when I, having in my hand a rich diamond ring, heedlessly, in a fit of absence, threw it into that part of the river. While I was exclaiming against my own stupidity, the diver made a plunge towards where I had cast the ring, and in less than 2 minutes reappeared with the coffee cup in his hand, when, to my great surprise, within it I also found my ring. I rewarded him liberally, and was exulting in the recovery of my jewels, when it suddenly struck my mind that such unusual good fortune must speedily be followed by some disaster. This reflection made me melancholy, and I returned home with a foreboding sadness,
Not without cause, for that very night my enemies accused me falsely of treason to the Sultan, who believed the charge, and next morning I was hurried to this gloomy cell, where I have now remained 7 years with only bread and water for my support. God, however, has given me resignation to his decrees, and this day an accident occurred which makes me confident of release before night and restoration to the Sultan's favour, which, as I have always done, I will endeavour to deserve. You must know, venerable dervish, that this morning I felt an unconquerable longing to taste a bit of flesh, and earnestly entreated my keeper, giving him at the same time a piece of gold, to indulge my wish. The man, softened by the present, brought me a stew, on which I prepared to make a delicious meal. But while, according to custom before eating, I was performing my ablutions, guess my mortification when a huge rat running from his hole leaped into the dish which was placed upon the floor. I was near fainting with agony at the sight, and could not refrain from tears. But at length, recovering from the poignancy of disappointment, the rays of comfort darted upon my mind, and I reflected that as disgrace and imprisonment had instantaneously followed the fortunate recovery of my cup and ring, so this mortification, a greater than which could not have happened, would be immediately succeeded by returning prosperity. In this conviction I prevailed on the gaoler to order my domestics to make ready my house and expect my return. The disguised Sultan, who, while the Wazir was speaking, felt every word impress him more and more with the conviction of his innocence, had much difficulty to support his assumed character, but not choosing his visit to the prison should be known at present, he restrained his feelings, and when the minister had finished took his leave, saying he hoped his presage would be fulfilled. He then returned undiscovered to the palace, and, entering his cabinet, resumed his usual habit, after which he issued orders for the release of the Wazir, sending him a robe of honour and splendid attendants to escort him to court, at the same time condemning to confiscation and imprisonment his malicious accusers. On his arrival, the Sultan received the Wazir with the most gracious distinction, and having presented him with the canopy of state, the seal and the inkstand set with red jewels, the insignia of the office, conducted him to a private chamber, where falling upon his neck he embraced him, and requested him to forget past oppression, informed him of his disguised visit to the prison, after which he dismissed him to his own palace. End of section number 46. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Story of the Lady of Cairo and her 4 gallants. A virtuous lady of Cairo, who seldom left her house but upon urgent business, one day returning from the bath, passed by the tribunal of the Qazi just as it was breaking up, when the magistrate perceived her, and struck with her dignity and elegance of gait, from which he judged of her beauty, called her to him, and in a soft whisper expressed his desire of a private interview. The lady, being resolved to punish him for his unworthy conduct, seemingly consented, and desired him to repair to her house that evening, which he gladly promised. She then pursued her route homewards, but was on the way accosted by 3 other men, who made her similar proposals, all which she accepted, and fixed that evening for receiving their visits. The first of these gallants was the customs tax collector of Cairo, the second the chief of the butchers, and the third a rich merchant. When the lady returned to her house, she informed her husband of what had happened, and begged him to permit her to execute a stratagem that she had formed to punish their insolence, which would not only afford himself and her much laughable amusement, but solid advantage, as doubtless the lovers would each bring with him a handsome present. The husband, who knew he could trust the virtue of his wife, readily consented, and the lady, having prepared a handsome entertainment, adorned herself in her richest apparel, and seated herself to receive her guest. Evening had just shut in, when the venerable Qazi, having finished his sunset devotions, impatiently repaired first to his mistress and knocked at the door, which the lady opened and led him upstairs, where he presented her with a rosary of valuable pearl, after which she made him undress, and in place of his robes put on a loose vest of yellow muslin and a party-coloured cap, her husband all the while looking at them through the door of a closet, and ready to burst his sides with laughter as he beheld the tender grimaces of the enamoured magistrate. The happiness of the venerable gallant was however soon changed to frightful alarm, for he had scarcely sat down and begun to partake of some refreshment when a loud rap was heard at the door, upon which the lady, starting up in well-affected terror, cried out, "Mohammed protect us, for this is my husband's knock, and if he finds you here, he will put us both to death." The Qazi's heart sank within him, and he became more dead than alive. But the lady somewhat revived him by thrusting him into her bedchamber, desiring him to remain still, as possibly a way might be found for his escape. He gladly retired, secretly vowing that if spared from his present threatening distress, Satan should no more tempt him to make love or break the sacred law. The lady, having disposed of the Qazi, hastened to the door, where she found the expecting tax collector, who brought with him as a present a set of jewels. She shooed him upstairs, took off his rich clothes, and made him put on a crimson vest and a green cap with black spots. He had scarcely sat down when the door again resounded, and she played over the same game as she had done with the Qazi, who on his also entering the bedchamber was somewhat pleased at seeing a brother magistrate in the same ridiculous plight with himself. The venerable lovers condoled by signs with each other, but dared not speak for fear of discovery. The chief of the butchers, on his arrival, was next ushered upstairs, and his present received, then made to undress and put on a blue vest with a scarlet cap, ornamented with sea-shells and bits of tinsel. But he had scarce time to finish, when a fourth loud rap was heard at the door. The scene of alarm was renewed, and the frightened gallant hurried into the room to keep company with his rivals. Now appeared the respectable merchant, who presented the cunning lady with several rich veils, pieces of silk, and embroidered muslins, after which he was asked to undress and enrobe himself in a sky-coloured vest and a cap striped with red and white, which he had hardly put on when a thundering knock at the gate put an end to his transports, and the wife, pretending great alarm, as it was her husband's rap, forced him into the bedchamber, where, to his surprise, he discovered 3 of his intimate acquaintance. The husband, who had left his hiding place and knocked at the door, now entered, and, after saluting his wife, sat down, when having partaken of the refreshments provided for the gallants, the happy couple entered into conversation loud enough to be overheard by the wretched innamorati, who were quaking for fear of discovery. "Light of my eyes," said the husband, "didst thou meet with anything amusing to-day in thy visit to the bath? And if so, divert me with an account of it." "I did, indeed," said the lady, "for I met with 4 antic creatures, whom—" At hearing this, the unfortunate lovers gave themselves over for lost. "I had a great inclination to bring home with me." Here they recovered a little from their alarm, "to divert us, but fearful of your displeasure, I did not. However, if agreeable, we can send for them to-morrow." The frightened gallants now indulged some hopes of escape through the kindness of their cunning mistress, and began to breathe a little freer, but very short was the suspension of their fears. "I am sorry thou didst not bring them," said the husband, "because business will to-morrow call me from home, and I shall be absent for some days." Upon this, the lady, laughing, said, "Well then, you must know that in fact I have brought them, and was diverting myself with them when you came in. But fearful you might suspect something wrong, I hurried them into our bedchamber, in order to conceal them till I had tried your temper, hoping, should you not be in a good humour, to find some means of letting them out undiscovered." It is impossible to describe the alarm into which the wretched gallants were now plunged, especially when the husband commanded his wife to bring them out one by one, saying, "Let each entertain us with a dance, and then recite a story. But if they do not please me, I will strike off their heads." "Heavens protect us," said the Qazi. "How can men of our gravity dance?" but there is no resisting the decrees of fate, nor do I see any chance of escape from this artful baggage and her savage husband but by performing as well as we can." His companions were of the same opinion, and mustered what courage they could to act as they should be ordered. The wife now entered the chamber, and, putting a tambourine into the Qazi's hands, led him out and began to play a merry tune upon her lute, to which the affrighted magistrate danced with 1,000 antics and grimaces like an old baboon, beating time with the tambourine, to the great delight of the husband, who every now and then jeeringly cried out, "Really, wife, if I did not know this fellow was a buffoon, I should take him for our Qazi. But God forgive me, I know our worthy magistrate is either at his devotions or employed in investigating cases for tomorrow's decision." Upon this the Qazi danced with redoubled vigour and more ridiculous gestures, in hopes of evading discovery. At length he was overpowered by such unusual exercise, but the husband had no mercy upon his sufferings, and made him continue capering by threatening the bastinado, till the tired judge was exhausted, and fainted upon the floor in a bath of perspiration, when they held him up, and pouring a goblet of wine down his throat, it somewhat revived him. He was now suffered to breathe a little, and something given him to eat, which, with a second cup of liquor, recovered his strength. The husband now demanded his story, and the Qazi, assuming the gesture of a coffee-house droll, began as follows. End of section number 47. Jonathan Scott. Story of the Lady of Cairo and Her 4 Gallants. The Qazi's Story. A young tailor, whose shop was opposite the house of an officer, was so attracted from his work by the appearance of a beautiful young lady, his wife, in her balcony, that he became desperately in love, and would sit whole days waiting her coming, and when she showed herself, make signs of his passion. For some time his ridiculous action diverted her, but at length she grew tired of the farce she had kept up by answering his signals, and of the interruption it gave to her taking the fresh air, so that she resolved to punish him for his presumption, and oblige him to quit his stall. Having laid her plan, one day, when her husband was gone out for a few hours, she dispatched a female slave to invite the tailor to drink coffee. To express the rapture of the happy snip is impossible. He fell at the feet of the slave, which he kissed as the welcome messengers of good tidings, gave her a piece of gold, and uttered some nonsensical verses that he had composed in praise of his beloved. Then, dressing himself in his best habit, he folded his turban in the most tasty manner, and curled his mustachios to the greatest advantage, after which he hastened exultingly to the lady's house, and was admitted to her presence. She sat upon a rich musnud, and gracefully lifting up her veil, welcomed the tailor, who was so overcome that he had nearly fainted away with excess of rapture. She desired him to be seated, but such was his bashfulness that he would not approach farther than the corner of the carpet. Coffee was brought in, and a cup presented him, but not being used to such magnificence in form, and his eyes also being staringly fixed on the beauties of the lady, instead of carrying the cup to his mouth, he hit his nose and overthrew the liquid upon his vest. The lady smiled, and ordered him another cup, but while he was endeavouring to drink it with a little more composure, a loud knock was heard at the door, and she, starting up, cried out with great agitation, "Good heavens! This is my husband's knock. If he finds us together, he will sacrifice us to his fury." The poor tailor, in terror, fell flat upon the carpet, when the lady and her slave threw some cold water upon his face, and, when a little recovered, hurried him away to a chamber, into which they forced him, and desired him to remain quiet, as the only means of saving his life. Here he remained quivering and trembling, more alive than dead, but perfectly cured of his love, and vowing never again to look up at a balcony. When the tailor was disposed of, the lady again sat down upon her stool, and ordered her slave to open the door. Upon her husband's entering the room, he was surprised at beholding things set out for an entertainment, and inquired who had been with her, when she replied tartly, "A lover," "And where is he now?" angrily replied the officer. "In yonder chamber, and if you please, you may sacrifice him to your fury, and myself afterwards." The officer demanded the key, which she gave him, but while this was passing, the agony of the unfortunate tailor was worse than death, he fully expecting every moment to have his head struck off. In short, he was in the most pitiable condition. The officer went to the door, and had put the key into the lock, when his wife burst suddenly into a fit of laughter, upon which he exclaimed angrily, "Who do you laugh at?" "Why, at yourself, to be sure, my wise lord," replied the lady, "for who but yourself could suppose a woman serious when she told him where to find out a concealed lover? I wanted to discover how far jealousy would carry you, and invented this trick for the purpose." The officer, upon this, was struck with admiration of his wife's pleasantry and his own credulity, which so tickled his fancy that he laughed immoderately, begged pardon for his foolish conduct, and then they spent the evening cheerfully together. After which, the husband going to the bath, his wife charitably released the almost dead tailor, and reproving him for his impertinence, declared if he ever again looked up at her balcony, she would contrive his death. The tailor, perfectly cured of love for his superior in life, made the most abject submission, thanked her for his deliverance, hurried home, prayed heartily for his escape, and the very next day took care to move from so dangerous a neighbourhood. The husband and wife were highly diverted with the Qazi's story, and after another dance permitted him to depart, and get home as well as he could in his ridiculous habit. How he got there, and what excuse he was able to make for so unmagisterial an appearance, we are not informed. But strange whispers went about the city, and the Qazi's dance became the favourite one, or the strolling drolls, whom he had often the mortification of seeing talking him of as he passed to and from the tribunal, and not unfrequently in causes of adultery the evidences and culprits would laugh in his face. He, however, never again suffered Satan to tempt him, and was scarcely able to look at a strange woman, so great was his fear of being led astray. When the Qazi was gone, the lady, repairing to the apartment, brought out the grave tax collector, whom her husband addressed by name, saying, "Venerable sir, how long have you turned droll? Can you favour me with a dance?" The tax collector made no reply, but began capering, nor was he permitted to stop till quite tired. He was then allowed to sit. Some refreshment was given him, and when revived, he was desired to tell a story. Knowing resistance vain, he complied. After having finished, he was dismissed, and the other gallants were brought in and treated in a like manner. End of section number 48. By Jonathan Scott. Story of the Merchant, his daughter, and the Prince of Eroc. A certain rich merchant was constantly repining because Providence had not added to his numerous blessings that of a child to inherit his vast wealth. This want destroyed the power of affluence to make him happy, and he importuned heaven with unceasing prayers. At length one evening, just as he had concluded his devotions, he heard a voice saying, "Thy request has been heard, and thou wilt have a daughter, but she will give thee much uneasiness in her 14th year by an amour with the Prince of Eroc, and remember there is no avoiding the decrees of fate." The merchant's wife that same night conceived, and at the usual time brought forth a daughter, who grew up an exquisite beauty. No pains were spared in her education, so that at 13 she became most accomplished, and the fame of her charms and perfections was spread throughout the city. The merchant enjoyed the graces of his child, but at the same time his heart was heavy with anxiety for her fate, whenever he called to mind the prediction concerning her, so that at length he determined to consult a celebrated dervish, his friend, on the possible means of averting the fulfilment of the prophecy. The dervish gave him but little hopes of being able to counteract the will of heaven, but advised him to carry the beautiful maiden to a sequestered mansion, situated among unfrequented mountains surrounding it on all sides, and the only entrance to which was by a dark cavern hewn out of the solid rock, which might be safely guarded by a few faithful domestics. "Here," said the dervish, "your daughter may pass the predicted year, and if any human care can avail, she may be thus saved from the threatened dishonor. But it is in vain for man to fight against the arms of heaven. Therefore prepare thy mind for resignation to its decrees." The merchant followed the advice of his friend, and, having made the necessary preparations, accompanied by him and attended by some white and black slaves of both sexes, arrived, after a month's journey, with his daughter at the desired mansion, in which, having placed her, he, after a day's repose, took his departure homewards with the dervish. Ample stores of all necessaries for her accommodation had been laid in, and slave male and female were left for her attendance and protection. Not many days had elapsed when an incident occurred, clearly proving the emptiness of human caution against the predestination of fate. The Prince of Irak, being upon a hunting excursion, outrode his attendants, and, missing his way, reached the gate of the cavern leading to the mansion, which was guarded by two black slaves, who, seeing a stranger, cried out to him to withdraw. He stopped his horse, and, in a supplicating tone, requested protection and refreshment for the night, as he had wandered from the road, and was almost exhausted from weariness and want of food. The slaves were moved by the representation of his distress, as well as awed by his noble appearance, and apprehending no danger from a single person, conducted him through the cavern into the beautiful valley in which stood the mansion. They then informed their mistress of his arrival, who commanded him to be introduced into an apartment in which an elegant entertainment was provided, where she gave him the most hospitable reception. To become known to each other was to love, nor was it long ere the prediction respecting the merchant's daughter proved fully verified. Some months passed in mutual happiness, when the prince, becoming anxious to return to his friends, took leave of his mistress, promising when he had seen his family to visit her again and make her his wife. On his way he met the merchant, who was coming to see his daughter. Halting at the same spot, they fell into conversation, in which each inquired after the other's situation, and the prince, little aware to whom he was speaking, related his late adventure. The merchant, convinced that all his caution had been vain, concealed his uneasiness, resolved to take his daughter home, make the best of what had happened, and never again to struggle against fate. On his arrival at the cavern, he found his daughter unwell, and before they reached their own abode, she was delivered of a male infant, who, to save her credit, was left exposed in a small tent with a sum of money laid under its pillow, in hopes that the first passenger would take the child under his care. It so happened that a caravan passing by, the leader of it, on examining the tent and seeing the infant, took it up, and having no children adopted it as his own. The Prince of Irak, having seen his parents, again repaired to visit his beautiful mistress, and, on his journey to the cavern, once more met the merchant, who, at his daughter's request, was travelling towards Irak to acquaint him with her situation. The prince, overjoyed, accompanied the merchant home, married the young lady, and, with her parents, returned to his dominions. Their exposed son, after long inquiry, was discovered, and liberal rewards bestowed on the leader of the caravan, who, at his own request, was permitted to reside in the palace of Irak, and superintend the education of his adopted son. End of section number 49.
Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 50, The Adventures of the Qazi, His Wife, etc. In the capital of Baghdad, there was formerly a Qazi who filled the seat of justice with the purest integrity, and who, by his example in private life, gave force to the strictness of his public decrees. After some years spent in this honorable post, he became anxious to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, and having obtained permission of the Caliph, departed on his pious journey, leaving his wife, a beautiful woman, under the protection of his brother, who promised to respect her as his daughter. The Qazi, however, had not long left home when the brother, instigated by passion, made love to his sister-in-law, which she rejected with scorn. Being, however, unwilling to expose so near a relative to her husband, she endeavored to divert him from his purpose by argument on the heinousness of his intended crime, but in vain. The abominable wretch, instead of repenting, again and again offered his love, and at last threatened, if she would not accept his love, to accuse her of adultery and bring upon her the punishment of the law. This threat having no effect, the atrocious villain suborned evidences to swear that they had seen her in the act of infidelity, and she was sentenced to receive 100 strokes with a knotted whip and be banished from the city. Having endured this disgraceful punishment, the unhappy lady was led through Baghdad by the public executioner, amid the taunts and scorns of the populace, after which she was thrust out of the gates and left to shift for herself. Relying on Providence, and without complaining of its decrees, she resolved to travel to Mecca in hopes of meeting her husband, and clearing her defamed character to him whose opinion alone she valued. When advanced some days on her journey, she entered a city, and perceived a great crowd of people following the executioner, who led a young man by a rope tied about his neck. Inquiring the crime of the culprit, she was informed that he owed 100 dinars, which, being unable to pay, he was sentenced to be hung, such being the punishment of insolvent debtors in that city. The Qazi's wife, moved with compassion, immediately tendered the sum, being nearly all she had, when the young man was released, and falling upon his knees before her, vowed to dedicate his life to her service. She related to him her intention of making the pilgrimage to Mecca, upon which the young man requested to accompany and protect her, to which she consented. They set out on their journey, but had not proceeded many days, when the youth forgot his obligations, and giving way to impulse, insulted his benefactress by offering her his love. The unfortunate lady reasoned with him on the ingratitude of his conduct, and the youth seemed to be convinced and repentant, but revenge rankled in his heart. Some days after this they reached the seashore, where the young man, perceiving a ship, made a signal to speak with it, and the master, letting down his boat, sent it to land, upon which the young man, going on board the vessel, informed the master that he had for sale a handsome female slave, for whom he asked 1,000 dinars. The master, who had been used to purchase slaves upon that coast, went on shore, and looking at the Qazi's wife, paid the money to the wicked young man, who went his way, and the lady was carried on board the ship, supposing that her companion had taken the opportunity of easing her fatigue by procuring her a passage to some seaport near Mecca. But her persecution was not to end here. In the evening she was insulted by attentions of the master of the vessel, who, being surprised at her coolness, informed her that he had purchased her as his slave for 1,000 dinars. The unfortunate lady told him that she was a free woman, but this had no effect on the brutish sailor, who, finding tenderness ineffectual, proceeded to force and blows in order to reduce her to submit to his authority. Her strength was almost exhausted when suddenly the ship struck upon a rock. The master was hurried upon deck, and in a few moments the vessel went to pieces. Providentially, the virtuous wife, laying hold of a plank, was wafted to the shore, after being for several hours buffeted by the waves. Having recovered her senses, she walked inland, and found a pleasant country abounding in fruits and clear streams, which satisfied her hunger and thirst. On the second day she arrived at a magnificent city, and on entering it was conducted to the Sultan, who, inquiring her story, she informed him that she was a woman devoted to a religious life, and was proceeding on the pilgrimage to Mecca, when her vessel was shipwrecked on his coast, and whether any of the crew had escaped she knew not, as she had seen none of them since her being cast ashore on a plank. But as now the hopes of her reaching the sacred house were cut off, if the Sultan would allot her a small hut, and a trifling pittance for her support, she would spend the remainder of her days in prayers for the prosperity of himself and his subjects. The Sultan, who was truly devout, and pitied the misfortune of the lady, gladly acceded to her request, and allotted a pleasant garden house near his palace for her residence, at which he often visited her and conversed with her on religious topics, to his great edification and comfort, for she was sensibly pious. Not long after her arrival, several refractory vassals, who had for years withheld their usual tribute, and against whom the good Sultan, unwilling to shed blood, though his treasury much felt the defalcation, had not sent a force to compel payment, unexpectedly sent in their arrears, submissively begged pardon for their late disobedience, and promised in future to be loyal in their duty. The Sultan, who attributed this fortunate event to the successful prayers of his virtuous guest, mentioned his opinion to his courtiers in full divan, and they to their dependents. As, according to the proverb, the sheep always follow their leader, so it was in the present instance. All ranks of people on every emergency flocked to beg the prayers and counsel of the Sultan's favorite devotee, and such was their efficacy that her clients every day became more numerous, nor were they ungrateful, so that in a short time the offerings made to her amounted in value to an incalculable sum. Her reputation was not confined to the kingdom of her protector, but spread gradually abroad through all the countries in the possession of true believers, who came from all parts of Asia to solicit her prayers. Her residence was enlarged to a vast extent, in which she supported great numbers of destitute persons, as well as entertained the crowds of poor people who came in pilgrimage to so holy a personage as she was now esteemed. But we must now return to her pious husband. The good Qazi, having finished the ceremonies of his pilgrimage at Mecca, where he resided 1 year and visited all the holy spots around, returned to Baghdad. But dreadful was his agony and grief when informed that his wife had played the harlot, and that his brother, unable to bear the disgrace of his family, had left the city and had not been heard of since. This sad intelligence had such an effect upon his mind that he resolved to give up worldly concerns and adopt the life of a wandering religious, to move from place to place, from country to country, and visit the devotees celebrated for sanctity in each. For 2 years he traveled through various kingdoms, and at length, hearing of his wife's fame, though he little supposed the much talked of female saint stood in that relation to himself, he resolved to pay his respects to so holy a personage. With this view he journeyed towards the capital of the Sultan, her protector, hoping to receive benefits from her pious conversation and prayers. The Qazi on his way overtook his treacherous brother, who, repenting of his wicked life, had turned mendicant, and was going to confess his sins and ask the prayers for absolution of the far-famed religious woman. Time and alteration of dress, for they were both habited as dervishes, caused the brothers not to know each other. As fellow travelers they entered into conversation, and finding they were both bound the same way, agreed to continue their journey together. They had not proceeded many days when they came up with a driver of camels, who informed them that he was upon the same errand as themselves, having been guilty of a horrid crime, the reflection upon which tormented his conscience and made life miserable, that he was going to confess his sins to the pious devotee and consult her on whatever penance could atone for his villainy, of which he had heartily repented, and hoped to attain the mercy of heaven by a sincere reformation of life. The crime of this wretch was no less than murder, the circumstances of which we forgot to detail in its proper place. The Qazi's wife, immediately after her expulsion from Baghdad, and before she had met the young man who sold her for a slave, had taken shelter in the hut of a camel breeder, whose wife owed her great obligations, and had received her with true hospitality and kindness, consoling her in her misfortunes, dressing her wounds, and insisting on her stay until she should be fully recovered of the painful effects of her unjust and disgraceful punishment. And in this she was seconded by the honest husband. With this humble couple, who had an infant son, she remained some time, and was recovering her spirits and beauty when the wicked camel breeder, first mentioned, arrived on a visit to her host, and being struck with her beauty, made love to her, which she mildly but firmly rejected, informing him that she was a married woman. Blinded by passion, the wretch pressed his addresses repeatedly, but in vain, till at length, irritated by refusal, he changed his love into furious anger, and resolved to revenge his disappointed lust by her death. With this view he armed himself with a poniard, and about midnight, when the family were asleep, stole into the chamber where she reposed, and close by her the infant son of her generous host. The villain, being in the dark, made a random stroke, not knowing of the infant, and instead of stabbing the object of his revenge, plunged his weapon into the bosom of the child, who uttered loud screams, upon which the assassin, fearful of detection, ran away and escaped from the house. The Qazi's wife, awakening in a fright, alarmed her unhappy hosts, who, striking a light, came to her assistance. But how can we describe their agonizing affliction when they beheld their beloved child expiring, and their unfortunate guest, who had swooned away, bathed in the infant's blood? From such a scene we turn away, as the pen is incapable of description. The unhappy lady at length revived, but their darling boy was gone forever. Some days after this tragical event, she began her pilgrimage, and, as above stated, reached the city where she released the young man from his cruel creditors, and was shortly afterwards ungratefully sold by him as a slave. But to return to the good Qazi and his wicked companions. They had not travelled far when they overtook a young man, who saluted them and inquired their course, of which being informed, he begged to join in company, saying that he also was going to pay his respects to the celebrated religious, in hopes that by her prayers he might obtain pardon of God for a most flagitious ingratitude, the remorse for which had rendered him a burden to himself ever since the commission of the crime. The 4 pilgrims pursued their journey, and a few days afterwards overtook the master of a vessel, who told them he had some time back suffered shipwreck, since which he had undergone the severest distress, and was now going to request the aid of the far-famed woman, whose charities and miraculous prayers had been noised abroad through all countries. The companions then invited him to join them, and they proceeded on the pilgrimage together, till at length they reached the capital of the good sultan who protected the Qazi's wife. The 5 pilgrims, having entered the city, repaired immediately to the abode of their respected devotee, the courts of which were crowded with petitioners from all parts, so that they could with difficulty gain admission. Some of her domestics, seeing they were strangers newly arrived, and seemingly fatigued, kindly invited them into an apartment, and to repose themselves while they informed their mistress of their arrival, which, having done, they brought word that she would see them when the crowd was dispersed, and hear their petitions at her leisure. Refreshments were then brought in, of which they would desire to partake, and the pilgrims, having made their ablutions, sat down to eat, all the while admiring and praising the hospitality of their pious hostess, who, unperceived by them, was examining their persons and features through the lattice of a balcony at one end of the hall. Her heart beat with joyful rapture when she beheld her long-lost husband, whose absence she had never ceased to deplore, but scarcely expected ever to meet him again, and great was her surprise to find him in company with his treacherous brother, her infamous intending assassin, her ungrateful betrayer, the young man, and the master of the vessel to whom he had sold her as a slave. It was with difficulty she restrained her feelings, but not choosing to discover herself till she should hear their adventures, she withdrew into her chamber, and being relieved by tears, prostrated herself on the earth, and offered up thanksgivings to the protector of the just, who had rewarded her patience under affliction by succeeding blessings, and at length restored to her the partner of her heart. Having finished her devotions, she sent to the Sultan, requesting him to send her a confidential officer who might witness the relations of 5 visitors whom she was going to examine. On his arrival, she placed him where he could listen unseen, and covering herself with a veil, sat down on her stool to receive the pilgrims, who, being admitted, bowed their foreheads to the ground. When requesting them to arise, she addressed them as follows: "You are welcome, brethren, to my humble abode, to my counsel and my prayers, which by God's mercy have sometimes relieved the repentant sinner. But as it is impossible I can give advice without hearing a case, or pray without knowing the wants of him who entreats me, you must relate your histories with the strictest truth, for equivocation, evasion, or concealment will prevent my being of any service. and this you may depend upon, that the prayers of a liar tend only to his own destruction. Having said this, she ordered the Qazi to remain, but the other four to withdraw, as she should, to spare their shame before each other, hear their cases separately. The good Qazi, having no sins to confess, related his pilgrimage to Mecca, the supposed infidelity of his wife, and his consequent resolve to spend his days in visiting sacred places and holy personages, among whom she stood so famous that to hear her edifying conversation and entreat the benefit of her prayers for his unhappy wife was the object of his having travelled to her sacred abode. When he had finished his narrative, the lady dismissed him to another chamber, and heard one by one the confessions of his companions, who, not daring to conceal anything, related their cruel conduct towards herself, as above mentioned, but little suspecting that they were acknowledging their guilt to the intended victim of their evil passions. After this, the Qazi's wife commanded the officer to conduct all five to the Sultan, and inform him of what he had heard them confess. The Sultan, enraged at the wicked behavior of the Qazi's brother, the camel driver, the young man, and the master of the vessel, condemned them to death, and the executioner was preparing to put the sentence in force, when the lady arriving at the presence demanded their pardon, and to his unspeakable joy discovered herself to her delighted husband. The Sultan, complying with her request, dismissed the criminals, but prevailed on the Qazi to remain at his court, where for the remainder of his life this upright judge filled the high office of chief magistrate with honor to himself and satisfaction to all who had causes tried before him, while he and his faithful partner continued striking examples of virtue and conjugal felicity. The Sultan was unbounded in his favor towards them, and would often pass whole evenings in their company in friendly conversation, which generally turned upon the vicissitudes of life and the goodness of Providence in relieving the sufferings of the faithful by divine interposition at the very instant when ready to sink under them and overwhelmed with calamity. I myself, said the Sultan, am an example of the protection of heaven, as you, my friends, will learn from my adventures. He then began as follows. End of section 50. Recording by Anne Erickson, Toronto.
Volume 4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 51. Adventures of the Qazi, his wife, etc. The Sultan's story of himself. Though now seated on a throne, I was not born to such exalted rank, but am the son of a rich merchant in a country far distant from this which I now govern. My father brought me up to his own profession, and by instruction and example encouraged me to be virtuous, diligent, and honest. Soon after I had attained to the age of manhood, death snatched away this valuable parent, who in his last moments gave me instructions for my future conduct, but particularly requested that nothing might ever prevail upon me to take an oath, though ever so just or necessary to my concerns. I assured him it would not. Soon after which he breathed his last, leaving me, my mother, and sister in sincere grief for his loss. After the funeral I examined his property, and found myself in possession of a vast sum of money, besides an ample stock in trade, 2/3 of which I immediately paid to my mother and sister, who retired to a house which they purchased for themselves. Many weeks had not elapsed when a merchant set up a claim on my father's estate for a sum of money equal to nearly the whole that I possessed. I asked him for his bond, but he had none, yet swore solemnly to the justice of his demand. I had no doubt of the falsity of his oath, but as I had promised never to swear, I could not disprove it by mine, and therefore was obliged to pay the money, which I did entirely from my own share, not choosing to distress my mother and sister by lessening theirs. After this, other unjust demands were preferred, and I paid them rather than falsify my promise to my father, though by so doing I became reduced to the most abject poverty, as still I would not trouble my mother. At length I resolved to quit my native city, and seek for subsistence in a distant country as a clerk to a merchant, or in any other way that might offer. I accordingly set out alone, and had travelled some days, when in passing over a sandy desert I met a venerable looking personage, dressed in white, who, kindly accosting me, inquired the object of my journey; upon which I related my story. The old man blessed me, highly praised the steadfastness of my adherence to the promise I had made to a dying father, and said, "My son, be not dismayed. Thy virtuous conduct has been approved by our holy prophet, who has interceded for thee at the throne of bounty. Follow me, and reap the reward of thy sufferings." I did as he desired, and we after some time reached this city, which was then wholly depopulated, and even this palace in a state of decay. On our entrance my venerable guide bade me welcome, saying, "Here Heaven has decreed thee to reign, and thou wilt soon become a powerful sultan." He then conducted me to the palace, and we descended from one of the apartments into a vault, where to my astonishment I beheld vast heaps of gold and silver ingots, large bags of coins of the same metals, and several rich chests filled with jewels of inestimable value, of all which he saluted me master. I was overcome with astonishment, but said, "Of what use is all this wealth to a depopulated city, and how can I be sultan without subjects?" The old man smiled and said, "Have patience, my son. This evening a numerous caravan will arrive here composed of emigrants, who are in search of a settlement, and they will elect thee their sovereign." His words proved true. The caravan arrived, when the old man invited them to inhabit the city. His offer was gladly accepted, and by his direction they declared me their sultan. My protector remained with me a whole year, during which he gave me instructions how to govern, and I became what I am. Heaven has prospered my endeavors to do good. The fame of my liberality, justice, and clemency soon spread abroad. The city was soon filled with industrious inhabitants, who repaired the decayed buildings and erected new ones. The country round became well cultivated, and our port was filled with vessels from every quarter. I shortly after sent for my family, for I had left behind me a wife and 2 sons, and you may guess from your own joy at meeting after long separation what must have been mine on such an occasion. My venerable patron, at the expiration of the year, one day thus addressed me: "My son, as my mission is completed, I must now leave you. But be not alarmed, for provided thou continuest to act as thou hast begun, we shall meet again. Know that I am the prophet Khizr, and was sent by Heaven to protect thee. Mayest thou deserve its blessings." Having said thus, he embraced me in his arms, and then vanished, how I know not, from my sight. For some time I continued wrapped in astonishment and wonder, which at length gave place to reverential awe and gratitude to Heaven. By degrees I recovered myself, and bowed down with fervent devotion. I have endeavored to follow the admonitions of my holy adviser. It is unnecessary to say more. You see my state and the happiness I enjoy. End of Section 51. Entertainments, Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 52. Conclusion. The Sultan of the Indies could not but admire the prodigious and inexhaustible memory of the Sultaness his wife, who had entertained him so many nights with such a variety of interesting stories. 1,001 nights had passed away in these innocent amusements, which contributed so much towards removing the Sultan's unhappy prejudice against the fidelity of women. His temper was softened. He was convinced of the merit and great wisdom of the Sultaness Scheherazade. He remembered with what courage she had offered to be his wife, without fearing the death to which she knew she exposed herself, as so many sultanesses had suffered within her knowledge. These considerations, and the many other good qualities he knew her to possess, induced him at last to forgive her. "I see, lovely Scheherazade," said he, that you can ever be at a loss for these little stories, which have so long diverted me. You have appeased my anger. I freely renounce the law I had imposed on myself. I restore your sex to my favorable opinion, and will have you to be regarded as the deliverer of the many damsels I have resolved to sacrifice to my unjust resentment." The Sultaness cast herself at his feet, and embraced them tenderly with all the marks of the most lively and perfect gratitude. The Grand Vizier was the first who learned this agreeable intelligence from the Sultan's own mouth. It was instantly carried to the city, towns, and provinces, and gained the Sultan and the lovely Scheherazade, his consort, universal applause, and the blessings of all the people of the extensive empire of the Indies. End of Section 52. End of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4, translated by Jonathan Scott.